Meeting to order Tuesday, February 26, 2019. And if you could please stand with me, we're going to say the Pledge of Allegiance. I have a couple friends down here. They're going to come up and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. And then if you could, after the pledge, remain standing. Rabbi Sislin from Temple B'nai Jacob will lead us in our invocation. So, thank you. You remember the words, right? It's right there. So, whenever you're ready, you just go ahead and say, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Great. You want to stay up here for the invocation with us for a minute? Just for a minute?
You guys can probably share the mayor's chair.
Yes, yes, here you go. You can stand in front of you, right, so you can see better. Rabbi.
Our Heavenly Parent, when our ancestors left slavery and oppression, you blessed them with freedom. When they lacked sustenance, you provided for them. When they lacked guidance, you gave them your law and a path through life. Your legacy has been passed down to us and has built the foundation of our modern, free, democratic society. Our leaders legislate and direct our country and communities in accordance with your teachings. We ask your continued blessings for the leaders of the village of Wellington. May they have the wisdom of Solomon. May they have the compassion of Moses. May they have the faith of Abraham. May they have the strength of Samson. And may they have the humility of Job. We ask that you inspire them to govern in your spirit, bringing peace, love, and compassion to all that they do. The book of Psalms says in the original, Yehi shalom bechelech, shalva be'armonotayich, lama'an achai v'rayai adabrana shalom vach. May there be peace within your walls, tranquility within your palaces. For the sake of my brethren and friends, I shall speak of peace in your midst. We pray that adversity and intolerance will have no place in our beloved home. Almighty God, bless us, the citizens and leadership of the village of Wellington, the state of Florida, and the United States of America. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much.
Can I get this now?
I'm poking you. We had some art fans that were here earlier for the art show, so I roped them into that, Mr. Schofield.
Okay, that will bring us to the adoption of the agenda, and staff is recommending the agenda approval as presented.
Is there a motion?
Move to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Hearing none. The agenda is now approved.
There are no presentations and proclamations. That brings us to the consent agenda.
Are there any comments on the consent agenda?
Comments on the consent agenda, and staff is recommending approval as presented.
Seeing no comments on the consent agenda, is there a motion?
Motion to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Hearing none. Motion passes unanimously.
Okay. This is the one of the first of two opportunities for public comment. I do think we have some comment cards.
If anyone would like to speak on an item as it's read, you can do it. If you'd like to speak on any general item or speak now instead of later, you have that opportunity. Hearing none, we can go ahead with item 7.
All right, that will take us to the public hearings portions of the agenda. The item on the public hearing is ordinance number 2019-02, amendment to Chapter 72 entitled Mortgage Real Property Registration to provide an exemption to entities identified in 12 U.S.C. 4617 sub A sub 7. This is second reading. Ms. Newman will read by title, and Ms. Cohen will present.
Ordinance number 2019-02, an ordinance of Wellington, Florida's Council, amending certain sections of Chapter 72 of the Code of Ordinances entitled Mortgaged Real Property Registration to provide an exemption to those entities identified in 12 U.S.C. 4617A7, providing a conflicts clause, providing a severability clause, and providing an effective date.
This is the second reading of an amendment to the Mortgaged Real Property Registration Ordinance. And we revised this in response to a letter that was received from the General Counsel for the Federal Housing Finance Agency, objecting to the fees that were imposed on Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and servicers acting on their behalf for the registration. We looked at the case that was cited by the General Counsel and some other case law, and we think that decisions go both ways, but rather than, get into a battle over what amounts to a very small amount of fees, we felt that it was better to go ahead and provide that to the extent they're exempt under that particular provision of the law, that they would be exempt from the fee. They will still be required to register, but they will be exempt from the fee, and I believe that code enforcement estimates that there were approximately 16 or are currently approximately 16 entities that are, or registrations that fall within those provisions of Fannie, Freddie, or servicers acting on their behalf.
And we've discussed this, and this is the second reading. We've had no public comment either at the last one or at this one, and it's basically not changing anything about how we do business except not charging a fee for those mortgages under
Correct.
this condition.
And if it were later determined that that federal provision did not prohibit the collection of a fee, we could always continue, we could always begin collecting that again. There's nothing in the ordinance that would prohibit that.
Very well. Any further discussion on this item? We have to open a public hearing on
Correct.
this.
Move to
So-
open public hearing. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Hearing none. The public hearing is now open. Is there any comment from the public on this item? Hearing none, I'll accept a motion.
Move to close.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Hearing none. Public comment is now closed on this. Is there a motion on this ordinance?
Madam Mayor, I'll move to approve ordinance number 2019-02 on second reading.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Hearing none. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you, Ms. Cohen, for the work on this. Appreciate it.
All right, that brings us to the end of the public hearings and to the regular agenda. And the first item on the regular agenda is staff update on the town center concept. Mr. Barnes, Ms. Quicko, and Mr. Della Vega are here.
Good evening, council, mayor, manager. What we have this evening is just a staff summary with some points that we'd like to move forward on related to the town center project. To recap, similar to what we presented to council yesterday evening at agenda review, is we have the plans that were presented during the course of the various public engagement and outreach efforts that we had in the last few months. Both at the Lakeside Fun Day daytime and nighttime event, as well as the 3 public meetings that were held at the community center and Village Park. Just to go through the concept plans that were presented quickly, all of the plans that were presented showed a lot of the same elements, some remaining from plan to plan or concept to concept. The main thing being looking at different circulation options within the property, as well as green space options, expansion of green space, existing green space, playground areas, the waterfront area adjacent to the community center along the Lake Wellington, as well as options that include relocation of the aquatics facility and also elimination of the existing Lake Wellington Professional Center. New amenities that were considered, again, like I mentioned, they include green space and amphitheater area expansion, Scott's Place expansion, and additional play areas, including splash pads and water play areas, office, structured parking based on the elimination of surface parking spaces, and several of the elements include a partnership with adjacent private property as well. And those are in all the different concepts in varying degrees. Some of the concepts do show retention of the existing, some of the existing amenities like the pool or the LWPC. The following slides that you have in front of you now go through the actual visual preference surveys that we conducted at the Lakeside Fun Day in November and December. And the exhibits depict images, as is with typical visual preference surveys, of different options based on, again, some of those concept plans. And generally speaking, what we saw in a lot of the concepts was a support at the fun days for changes depending on which options were selected. For example, on the waterfront, which is the slide you're looking at now, we had a total of 597 responses, and only 28 were no change. Similarly, of those 597, 439 were resident responses, with only 13 of those being no change. Green space, similar concepts again. Majority of the responders favored some type of change, whether it be just additional seating, creative seating, some adult playground type improvements, hammocks, swings, etc., or just green space versus no change. Parking structure option just involved the concept of whether having some type of structured parking based on several of the concept plans actually showing the elimination of a considerable amount of surface parking to accommodate open space, green space, or other expansion to the existing amenities on the property. We did provide an option for no change as well. Water features, this is actually, we provided two different options during the process of both in November and December, and hence the split responses. And in the November option, we did show pool option, splash park, splash pad, or no change, whereas in the December option, we structured the options to focus more on water features that would be typical within a mixed-use type project, like a fountain or a splash pad or a reflecting pool, as well as the no change. Ken Adams Way, we looked at option really of providing some type of mixed-use development along Ken Adams Way that was walkable and also just more dense than would be normally expected in a suburban setting, and the majority there of the responses favored some type of change along Ken Adams Way. Lastly, 6 and 7 are actually related. In the November Lakeside Visual Preference Survey, we had a generalized category for Civic Center, and you had a majority of responses favoring some type of a Civic Center option. And we drilled down in the December option to actually look at a performing arts center, either at the town center location, but also based on size, potentially at another location. And you also still had a majority that favored some type of performing arts facility. So those are the two that are somewhat related. In the December, January, and February, we also had our actual in-person public engagement meetings, at which point I think altogether we had a little bit over 300 attendees at the 3 meetings combined. And based on that, generally, the results of those indicated that a lot of people did not support it at those meetings, did not support some of the changes proposed, but there was consensus generally on some things within the concept plans that were presented, that being enhanced circulation and around and in the town center, including support that seemed to be within the different tables at the January meeting at the Village Park location that indicated a lot of support for boardwalk improvement along Lake Wellington as well. Additionally, there was a lot of support for green space, but the conundrum that arose was that in a lot of cases, when you actually eliminate surface parking for green space, then that surface parking has to be made up someplace else. And that was a point of conflict in some of the discussion because there was not a desire in some cases for structured parking. However, the realization that there would be some type of parking shortfall beyond what we already have now for larger events would have to be solved in some way. Mr.
Barnes, if I could interrupt you just a minute.
Yes, ma'am.
So all the data that was just presented did not compile the town hall meetings. It was only the data that we were presented for transparency purposes. All of this data that was presented did not include any of the town hall meetings.
That's correct. Because
So
of
do
the
we
town.
have a compilation of those?
We do,
that
but there wasn't really any voting that took place. That was more of a discussion, and as you recall from the last meeting on the 13th of February, that was really an opportunity. There was some, what I'll call pent-up desire, because we heard it at every meeting we had, for the public to be able to just voice their opinions. And that's what we basically facilitated on the 13th, and we have those note cards. So there wasn't necessarily a preference per se. It was more, and a majority, like I said, did not really support a lot of change, except that what we did see on the in the January meeting at Village Park, where we had the breakout tables and the opportunity for the tables to actually discuss the concept plans, is there was consensus on circulation, some green space,
But
and
we
the boardwalk.
we still have that data. It's just
Oh,
not
we
compiled.
absolutely.
It's not compiled in this same way.
Right, we can't do that since there weren't
Because it's apples
votes.
and oranges
Right.
kind of a thing. So when we collected that data, we don't really have a good way to present that right now.
That's correct. In this manner, we can certainly present it in written format, but as far as a presentation, I'm doing my best to summarize it as we speak now. And basically, so the results at those tables, as I mentioned also yesterday, is that in a lot of cases, when you have the breakout table charrette format, unless you have a consensus of the group, it ends up being listed as not supported by the group. So in some cases, having observed different tables at different times throughout the evening, some items were not necessarily no, but since there was not consensus among the table members to move it forward or in their report back to be able to say that they supported it, it ended up falling out of the recommendations. So that's what you ended up having. And like I said, the ones that we did have consensus on appeared to be improved circulation throughout the property, in the property, boardwalk, and certainly passive green space. But again, that issue that vexes even the best of the planners is, if you provide green space at the expense of surface parking, where do we make up the parking? So that's generally a quick summary of what we saw at both the meetings as well as our Lakeside preference surveys.
Very well. Is there a desire to take public comment on this issue now, or would you like to?
Would you like
The
to go,
staff
let me
update.
summarize, this is the update.
Okay.
Would you like to go and have me summarize now or after the public comment, the different requests that we have
I
in the
think it'd be
agenda
good if we
item?
did that now.
Okay. Basically, the items that we'd like to have direction and consensus from council on is that, first, we would like to go ahead and proceed, since we've had these planning efforts that have been both consultant-assisted and staff-driven as well, to actually secure a team through the solicitation process to come in and actually start planning and ultimately have those stakeholder meetings and additional user group meetings, specifically the aquatic facility patrons, the LWPC tenants, the Mayfair residents, and have that team, as part of the planning process with staff, start that process. But if we go through the solicitation process, then we have one team that can be with us from start to finish, rather than be limited as we have been in the past to date. Additionally, we'd like to go ahead and also seek direction on a recommendation that we look at the existing dollars that have been still set aside from the LWPC rent collections that have not been utilized for capital improvements or any kind of debt service payment, that we go ahead and look at that to develop some type of an incentive program so that we could look at providing and or securing alternative space availability within Wellington.
There is no debt service on this.
Well, I've
Mr.
used the term
Barnes.
debt service and that paying back the original investment of $4 million.
You're talking about the general fund.
Correct.
Okay.
And those would allow us, those two efforts would allow us to go ahead and start the process to actually come up with conceptual plans, phasing plans, estimates, et cetera.
And that ultimately results then in, as you said in the item here, concrete yes, no decision points for us to really make as to whether we want to go forward with some of this, all of this, in what phases, et cetera. Is that, I mean, that's where we're
That's
headed.
correct. That's correct. At this point, one of the items that we have not been able to totally address, and one of the comments that we received regularly at our public engagement meetings has been the lack of financial data, the lack of hard numbers, the lack of schedules, phasing, et cetera. And in order to do that, we would need to have the services of the outside consultants and professionals to go ahead and provide us that information so that the council has a basis on which to make its decisions going forward.
All right. Do you have a comment?
Yeah,
Mr.
yeah, actually,
Vice
I have some
Mayor?
questions for Mr. Barnes. You've gone through those slides. I know you had a lot of material to cover, but you went through those slides so quickly. I want to go back and focus in on some of those numbers so that it's clear to the residents what some of these results were. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to take you through a few of them.
That's fine.
Starting with number one, the waterfront.
Give me 1 second to just... Yes, sir.
I want to focus my questions only on the Wellington residents that were polled. And as I understand this, 439 residents filled out surveys relating to whether or not they wanted changes to the waterfront. Is that an accurate assessment of what this figure shows here?
That's correct.
597 at the top of that page?
Yeah, 597 total, but 439 of which were Wellington residents, correct?
So out of the 597, the 439, approximately 70, almost 75%, were Wellington residents. And of that...
But just key in on the questions that I want to ask.
Okay.
So 439 were Wellington residents, 13 of which indicated they wanted no change to the waterfront. So what is the takeaway there? What percentage of Wellington residents indicated they wanted no changes to the waterfront?
About 3%.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide.
Next slide,
Who's got this
please.
slide? Flip
Number
to
two,
the next one,
please.
please.
Sure.
Okay, green space. So how many Wellington residents filled out a survey relating to whether or not they wanted change to green space?
No, 309.
And how many indicated they wanted no change?
16.
So what is the percentage of Wellington residents who filled out the survey who indicated they wanted no change to the green space?
It's a little bit over 5%.
Okay, let's move to the next one.
Next slide, please.
Okay, how many Wellington residents filled out a survey relating to adding a parking structure?
166.
And how many indicated they wanted no change or no parking structure?
45.
So what would be the percentage there?
Roughly 27%.
Okay, next one.
Next slide.
I'm controlling that too. Hold on. I'm working it here. Bruce, you might need to help me out with the percentages again.
Patience is not my strong suit. Take the thing from him.
Yes, sir. I'm ready.
Okay, so why are there two different figures here? Were there two different surveys done?
Yes, as I mentioned in the description, in November, we actually, if you'll notice the element options in the November visual preference survey, it was we had zero depth entry, splash park, and splash pad. So I would categorize those generally as more active recreational type aquatic options, water features, whereas in the December option, they're far more, I won't say passive, but they're not active aquatic play areas. They're,
Okay,
rather-
so let's focus on the November survey first.
Mhm.
So as I understand this, then when we look at the element part A, B, C, and G, that means during the November survey, the Wellington residents were shown picture A there, picture B, picture C, and picture G.
That's correct.
Okay, and how many Wellington residents were shown that and filled out a survey relating to those particular areas?
205,
And how many of the Wellington residents indicated they wanted no change or they didn't like any of those options?
16.
So what would be the percentage?
It's almost 8%.
Okay, and then let's talk about the December survey. They were shown picture D, E, F, and G.
That's correct.
And how many Wellington residents filled out a survey?
Their responses were 81,
And how many indicated they didn't like any of those options?
15 responses.
And what would be the percentage?
It's a little bit over 18.
Okay, let's move on to Ken Adams.
Excuse me, how many of them were repeats? Were there people that attended both meetings?
That we don't know. Yeah, we don't know who attended the first event versus the second event.
All right, go ahead.
Slide number 5.
I'm ready to
Okay, you're
go.
there.
Yeah,
All right.
Mr. Delavega's
Good, good.
jumping in
Sorry,
and
sorry.
helping me out. Slides ready.
All right, so how many Wellington residents filled out a survey relating to whether or not they wanted changes to Ken Adams Way?
We had 209 responses.
Okay, and they're showing those pictures there that are located along the graph or the chart?
That's correct.
Okay, and how many of the 209 indicated they didn't like any of those changes?
25,
What would be the percentage?
almost 12%.
Okay. Next slide. How many Wellington residents filled out a survey relating to whether or not they wanted a civic center?
208,
And how many indicated they didn't want anything like that?
22 responses.
And what's the percentage?
So almost 11%.
All right. And the performing arts? How many residents filled out a survey relating to the Performing Arts Center?
58,
How many indicated they didn't want one?
10 responses.
And what would be the percentage there?
So around 17%.
Okay.
Mr. Barnes, how many, if you could keep your questions, we will have public comment later. Mr. Barnes, how many residents are there in Wellington?
I'm going to say 63 or 64,000, depending
Okay,
on
so-
which data source.
So in order for us to do an accurate statistical study, how many would we have to have?
I'm not even going to pretend to know the answer to that. I'm not sure.
Okay.
There's percentages that are required to actually make it a statistically valid, but importantly, the other thing that you have to do for
Demographics would
right,
have
you've got to include
be this
demographics,
many of
not
this
just population.
Type of person, and
Correct.
so this is a spot question that we gathered data at.
Absolutely.
And that's what we have presented. We don't have the data that was presented in different formats. So this is a really broad brush look at what people said when they were at the event. Correct?
Correct. Just and one thing we actually surmised looking at the responses we received both at the Lakeside events and on the public engagement meetings we had is that you really had different attendees. What our staff noticed at the Lakeside Fun Days, where you had more younger families with kids, and at the meetings, painting myself in the same age group, people who are a little bit older, and maybe in some cases, kids were gone. That's just a unscientific, non-biased
Right, and
assessment.
that's my point, is
Right.
we're doing the best we can to get public input, and we're doing it in every way that we can
Correct.
find. But none of this is statistically correct as far as looking at our residents. But it does show that there is an interest in certain elements, and so as we go forward, I think it's good to have. But there's a couple things that have bothered me in the process. There's been rumors in the public that the pool has a structural failure. I've been told that staff members were representing that at meetings, that there's a structural failure on the pool. And I don't think that that's accurate. I think we spent a lot of money on the pool. If there's a problem with it, I would like to see the data that shows that, because it's a pretty new construction. It's 8 years old. If there was a failure, I think we need to go back and look at product liability. If there's no failure, that's, again, something. I want to be a team player. I want to go with the flow, but I'm not going to do it at the expense of truth or honesty in this process. I want to make sure that we are looking at apples to apples as much as we can, and that we're looking at good data. So that's my question.
I would agree with you, Madam Mayor, that I think controlling the rumors has been a challenge for everybody involved. And so we can only do our part to try and continue to convey accurate information, and certainly whatever staff can do to control the information and make sure that what Wellington sends out is accurate is within our control. But social media is a whole other animal. And I think we've seen already that that's been a bit of a struggle.
Well, and that's going to be a struggle in any social media changes all conversations, including, you know, personal and professional relationships. So, but in this case, I just want to make sure that we're not getting involved in putting out incorrect information. The other thing that I was told that they heard from staff was the building is old. And in our presentation, we were told the building needs, you know, $2.3 million worth of improvements to bring it up to our standards. Whereas the people who are using Lake Wellington Professional Center, it is 40 years old, parts of it. It's a wood frame structure. There are plenty of wood frame structures in Wellington that are just as old, and it doesn't mean they have reached their useful life. The home directly behind me is a wood frame home that's been on the market recently for $725,000, and nobody was walking up saying, tear it down, it's old. So I want to just make sure that we are being accurate. We talked about the construction standard that was met with it. It doesn't have impact windows. That's true. And when we do new construction in the village, we probably wouldn't do it that way. But it doesn't mean that the building has outlived its useful life, except, and honestly, when we bought the property, we did agree to buy the building as a land bank. So that conversation hasn't changed. When we bought the building, we bought it because of its location and for the land that it was on. So, and I've agreed with that the whole time too. That's why we bought it. And when the first plan came out showing that we were taking down a office space that provides a home to 150 plus or minus businesses, whether on-site or virtual, I said we better make sure we have a good reason. So my concern was never that we can't tear that building down, that we can't repurpose that site. It was that we should have a good reason if we're going to do that. And I do appreciate the staff's sincere work on not wanting to displace 150 businesses. I know that we all have said that we'd like to work together to make sure that our business community has its needs met. So I'm right back to the first thing I said, which is if we're going to tear down a building that supports 150 businesses for a kayak rental facility, then we maybe haven't thought this through very well. But if we need to displace that and we have a plan in place, then down the road, I would be open to a discussion on it. I think that we bought it for that reason. So is that,
Yeah,
understand my statement?
I do, and I appreciate it as well. And I think I don't want to get sidetracked with discussing the merits of LWPC tonight, because I really don't think it falls within the scope of what we're being asked to do. What we're being asked to do is hire a group to come in and give us a master plan for the property, and whether or not it includes changing LWPC or keeping it, I think is still open for discussion. But we are being asked about what to do with the funds that are in that account and whether or not we can use it to our advantage or to the advantage of the tenants, quite frankly. And so, you know, I don't get an
And
opportunity.
to the overall advantage of the community.
Of
Right? I mean,
course.
there's a, that is the larger question here.
Of course. And so, you know, I don't get an opportunity to share with you all what I do when I'm not up here. And so I think this is an opportunity to do that. And I want to say it now before the residents get a chance to talk, so that if they want to comment on what I have to say about this, they're given an opportunity to. But I have said in the past that I've been actively trying to solicit private investment groups to come in here and bring an executive suites office building to Wellington. Because if indeed the future of this building has really needs to be replaced, then I think we need to find alternatives. And so from my experience, I'm having a very hard time getting a private investment group to be able to match what we're offering at the private level. It's just, quite frankly, when they look at the numbers, they look at the building, they tell me I can't offer that price point. It's too low. It's well below market value. And I've had this now I'm into my third investment group.
Except,
So-
I have to say, when it comes to, we're not charging market value, I believe that we are. We have compared to Nexus, we've compared to Regis, and we are a little bit more than some of those.
I don't know where those figures are coming from, because I can tell you I've looked at 3 different investment groups in meetings, and they have told me, Michael, we can't offer that.
Because you're talking about someone coming in and building it from scratch. I'm talking about other
No, I'm
businesses.
not. I'm not.
So you think
No.
Nexus is?
My goal was to find an investment group who could provide executive suites at the BE Aerospace
Right.
building that's going to be vacant soon.
Right.
And so I've not explored options about building from the ground up. I've explored options about taking one building and retrofitting it for another purpose. And so, what each of them have told me at the conclusion of each one of these meetings, in which I just had a meeting on Monday, was if you can offer some sort of a subsidy that could offset some of the cost, we might be able to do it. And so I think it would be worthwhile for this council to consider it. But at this point, I can tell you that the private sector cannot match what we're doing over there, and I think that should give the residents concern. Why are we so far below market value?
I'm going to have to disagree vehemently with that. Comparing prices for the same service at Regis, which is not in Wellington, comparing prices for the same services at Nexus, which is not in Wellington, are lower at some points than what we're charging. So the market, you're comparing apples and oranges in this discussion. And looking back at when we purchased Lake Wellington Professional Center, we paid $4 million for that. No one would walk up and pay $4 million for something that's going to bring in $275,000 profit. That's not an ROI that an investor was willing to do. We bought it not for the purpose of having the building, but we bought it for the purpose of having the property. So the reason that you're not able to find someone that's offering something like that is a completely different reason. You can't compare the interior improvements that would be needed to turn it into executive office suites, because first of all, it wasn't built for that purpose. It's hard to do with that building. I've looked at it also with some other interested people also. It's difficult to do because of the way it was laid out. Again, it's not our obligation to provide that, but I think we all agree that we do not want to displace the businesses. But in fact, that's not why we purchased it in the first place. And no one would spend $4 million to make $175,000 profit a year. So that's the reason it's not working.
And I think I think we're saying a
But I
similar thing, just saying it differently.
I was literally just about to say that I am sitting here thinking that I agree with both of you.
Yeah, I mean,
And that's a rare moment. I think that I think that you're both saying the exact same thing, because one is saying there's a way that we can make this work potentially in a public-private partnership, and the other view is saying that we never bought that building to purely operate it as a investment property and to be a landlord. That's not what was done. And I think that those facts throughout this process have become crystal clear. Absolutely. And I think what we're saying tonight, as at least we look at this item and approach the questions that Mr. Barnes asked to us, which is, do we want to look at taking portions of the money that are in the Lake Wellington Professional Center Fund and venture into a possible public-private partnership that would allow for some form of small business incubator type place that would allow for these tenants and others to go to that place and have it be a greater success, and then to put back that land into the larger picture of what's going on this property. Isn't that, I mean, that's the question.
Right.
As it applies to that decision point.
That's correct.
I think we can all agree, we don't want to displace these tenants.
But we
Without some plan.
Right,
We
but
have to have a
I
plan.
just want to make sure people know that we are not subsidizing any local businesses. That's not what's happened. We bought the property for the reason of where it is. We are at market price. That's the part I argue with you on. We are at market price on it. We have raised the price every year. There has been cost raises involved in leasing those spaces. Some of those spaces had arrangements that we couldn't do as a government. Some of them were offering services to offset their rent, and we couldn't do that as a government. We had to bring it all into alignment so that it was all fair and done in a way. I just want to make sure we're being transparent about what we do and not give false information to the residents about it. So as we go forward, I think we should hear from the public before we, is that okay
Yeah, I think
with
Mr.
everyone?
Barnes
Before we
wants to
do that,
say
if I could,
something.
in the interest of kind of rumor control and transparency, one thing is, one bullet that we didn't hit on yet is one of the other asks we have on there is to move forward with the boardwalk circulation improvements within the property, particularly the boardwalk, given that from our estimation, both at the in-person public engagement meetings as well as the lakeside preference, visual preference surveys, there appeared to be consensus to move forward with the boardwalk improvement. And nothing we do with the boardwalk improvement would necessarily restrict or prohibit any kind of landside improvement or remaining as is.
The circulation question, I'm going to disagree with you on, because
But the boardwalk, they ask specifically to the boardwalk.
Oh,
that-
okay.
Yeah,
You're-
yeah.
Not
I
the
mean,
traffic, okay.
my point being that if we do the boardwalk along the entire waterfront, at any point, depending on whatever the final plan is, if it remains the same or changes, we would be able to tie into the circulation system that ultimately is developed or stays the same within the town center.
Understood, but we're going to get designs for that, and we're going to have discussions about that like we discussed yesterday, things like
Right.
docks and how we would lay it out.
Absolutely.
I mean, that still would be an ongoing discussion.
That'd be part of the
as a
design and
separate-
planning design process, correct.
Right.
And then the second point would be, again, in the interest of rumor control and transparency, two things. One, specific to the aquatics facility, very near and dear to my heart. I've been Parks and Rec director back in the early 2000s, and when we actually redid the facility, was involved with it quite a bit. We don't have specifically the last report that says there's structural issue, so I don't know if, I wouldn't call it a failure, but there is some concern that has been brought to our attention by both the swim team participants, as well as going back to when Mr. Reby was our engineer, he had looked into an issue within the dive well. There really hasn't been any deterioration probably since that time, but what I would suggest, and certainly it's envisioned by staff, is that would be part of the scope when we retain professionals to actually have the appropriate design professional look into it, do an evaluation, provide us the status on that. I can say, just again, interest of clarity, the building that wasn't improved there was the pump room. We did improvements within the pump system itself, but the building, the pump room is the same pump room. And then as far as the Lake Wellington Professional Center, a lot of the information we have on that was based on a pre-purchase investigation report that was prepared by, we hired a consultant to do that. And we based some of the improvements as far as cost that we thought the improvements would be based on that report, such as the re-roof and that type of thing. And I think the only concern would be, again, that could easily be incorporated into any kind of studies and review of the site, would be to look at that building, to have an accurate assessment of what improvements truly are necessary, and being cognizant of if there's any threshold at which point, once we exceed a certain value in renovations and improvements, do we trigger additional code upgrades, which would indicate additional costs as well.
Understood, and that's by law. That's
Right.
part of this
Correct.
process. So, I'm not a denier.
But I mean, in that
don't wanna get
regard,
thrown in
for
that.
example, that building is not ADA compliant currently.
There are components of it that are not, that's correct.
Right.
We don't have any vertical accessibility within the multi-story building.
Yes, we wouldn't be able to build that
Right.
identical product today.
In layman's terms, that means there's no elevator for a
that's-
two-story building.
Elevator, right.
I'm dying here. Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay.
Which we could say about a lot of elements that the village has are not ADA compliant because they were built before standards. That's not the only element.
No, I would go on the record on that all our facilities, based on a review that we perform on a regular basis, while we don't have a formal total transition plan, we have gone through, and all our facilities are compliant. The only part that we continue on an ongoing basis are the sidewalks and pathways throughout town, where over the course of time might be out of slope.
So
requirements?
I've been to second floor lofts in utility buildings that had no elevators, Jim.
No, which loft would that be?
Over in the water treatment plant. I mean, we have things. I'm just saying.
No, there are the
the
mechanical
standards that we're
exemptions.
applying.
There are
Uniform.
there are certain equipment areas that, based on the work that's performed there, have exemptions, just like Florida Power and Light substations don't have all the accessibility requirements because the work could not be reasonably performed by somebody who
Which
would
doesn't
require
apply
special
to,
accommodation.
which doesn't apply to an amphitheater service point. I was told we couldn't do that. We couldn't put the amphitheater service point in a building because you'd have to have an elevator for that. Even though, seems to me, that's a pretty unique circumstance.
Yeah, that's kind of
So again,
interesting.
we're getting off track.
Right.
Let's move ahead. If there are no other comments from the council, is it okay to take public comment now?
Yes, I'm good
Since
with
we
that.
have, okay, we have a few cards, Mr. Vice Mayor?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, we have Richard Kopp and Mark Davidson.
If your name is called, you can come to either one of these podiums if you'd like to speak. We request your name and address for the record, and then you have 3 minutes. And we're a little lenient about finishing only this one? Oh, only this one.
Oh, yeah, and I apologize. We have, the reason for that
We
is
have a
we're all going
problem.
to have to use that podium because,
Mr. Kopp, if you could just wait, you can have a seat because we only have one functional podium right now. I apologize.
and just so the audience knows, the reason for that is we have people providing sign language for this, and using that podium blocks that. So it's, until we
Okay.
get the closed captioning equipment in place, it will be a minor inconvenience for which we apologize.
Okay, very well. Name and address if you don't mind, and then your
Mark
3 minutes.
Davidson, 499 Azure Avenue, in the lovely village of Wellington. 30-year resident. What I want to bring up tonight is the entire process in this last 3 months of talking about the town center has appeared to be an attempt to sell it to the residents. The meetings that were talked about were not presented in the same light from the staff's viewpoint that the residents saw it. That first meeting with the stations showing these various layouts that were shown tonight, at every table, I asked every representative of the village that I could find, where's the demand for this issue coming from? And I couldn't get an answer from anybody. It was my impression at the end of that meeting that maybe this board was driving the train. At the second meeting, the table discussions were set up in a way to get positive comments. This was not done in a way to determine the will of the people. This was done in a way to get the people to say, yes, I like this. That's the way it was organized. That's the way it was developed. That's the way it was presented. I know exactly what was said at my table because, believe me, I was very active in the discussion. I met with people who attended other tables and listened to what they said about the discussion at their tables. The summary I've heard tonight had nothing to do with that discussion. The statistics that have been shown up here of the polling at the two events. I attended all 3 meetings. I only attended one of the events. I was not polled, don't care. However, this is not polling. It is, by definition and by the staff's statement, a visual preference survey. If I held up a picture with 6 adult males of various races and ethnicities and said, how many of these people look like criminals? That's a visual preference survey. That's not, is this a good thing? That's not, is this something that you would support us spending tax dollars on? Those kinds of questions have never been asked in this process. At the third meeting, the public had an opportunity to speak. I did not leave until every speaker had spoken, including myself. The public spoke very clearly that night, but that's not what was represented here tonight. The public said clearly, do not move forward with this huge expenditure without a public referendum. That was the consensus of the public that night. So that brings us to where...
Please, if you could wrap up, your 3 minutes
Okay.
are up, so please wrap
That brings
it
us
up.
to where what we've talked about tonight. We've talked about parking, Regency Center gave up 20% of their convenient parking spaces to allow the CVS to get built. They'll get 75% of that back when CVS is open. Let's not talk about building a parking garage because people got booted at a concert. That's gotten a lot of publicity. That's not a reason to drive a parking garage decision.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Your time is up.
I support moving forward with the RFP only. Let the planning begin, but require them to present plans both with and without Lake Wellington Professional Center so that you don't lock yourself into one path or the other.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Kopp, and then Bruce Tooman, you're on deck.
Good evening, Madam Mayor. Well, first of all, I want to talk about the previous meeting on the 13th. I gave Jim an article that was published in the Town Crier of that meeting. It was absolutely a joke. They never really talked about what really happened at that meeting. There were 70 people at that meeting. There were probably 20 or more, maybe 24 people that got up and spoke at that meeting. Only 2 people. One person had a bias because he was a swimming coach and he wanted more swimming pools, and the other person was for it. Everybody else that got up and spoke at that meeting was 100% against this project from the get-go. The previous mayor got up. He talked about the want. I had met with John McGovern. I had spoken with you, Mayor. And my perspective is the want is coming from this town council. I talked about having a referendum. I was told by you, Ms. Mayor, that it was against the regulations of the village to have a referendum. I find that very hard to believe. Then you came back and said, oh, it would be about $50,000 to have it. Well, $50,000 is a small price to pay when you're looking at spending $1.2 million just in the design and then up to $20 million in the whole, both projects. So I'd say $50,000 is a cheap price to pay. John McGovern, in my meeting with him, he said that he was for this because he and his family have lived in this village for decades and they know what's best for the village. He was elected, they were elected as part of the town council, therefore they have the right to make these kinds of decisions. I don't think you do. I think you have the right to bring those decisions forward and have a voters' referendum to spend this kind of money. It is ridiculous when every person up there got up and said, no, we don't want this. Spend money the right way. I don't mind spending tax dollars. I don't mind paying taxes, but I do mind paying taxes for the wrong things. And this is the wrong thing for this village. Thank you.
Bruce Tooman, and then I have John Green.
My name is Bruce Tooman. I reside at 752 Lake Wellington Drive in the village of Wellington. I attended all 3 meetings and participated. You all saw me there. But I was not aware that you were doing surveys at the Lakeside Fun Days, because I would have done there and I would have filled out a survey too. So since our update did not include the 3 meetings before, as we already said, these numbers should not be considered. They're to be at least questioned. Now, with these surveys, it did have an option of no action, which I appreciated, but I don't recall that being one of the options at the other 3 meetings. The staff recommendations for the office buildings, if you recall, I spoke up, since I'm a licensed engineer, I said, wait a minute, these aren't mandatory code requirements, these are recommendations. The ADA, there is some exemptions, depending on when you're gonna build. If you do decide to rebuild everything, you may have to come up to ADA. But as an existing building, we're not doing major renovation, you don't. But I was a little disappointed that the staff was kind of saying this is code requirements, and I would love to have the name of the consultant who gave you that recommendations. Now, if you want to build something, we need additional bathrooms at the amphitheater. Why don't you do that? How about extending the sound cable tunnel at the amphitheater all the way to the sound booth so people won't trip over it? That won't cost too much, but it's been like that for 5 years or more. Of course, you talk about the pathway around the community center, but we also have a sidewalk there already. So you're going to tear that down and put it up again? How about a dock, a fishing dock for us, or a boat, so I can dock my boat here? Now, if the staff doesn't listen to us, we will remember this next year election, because I hope you can be good stewards of our taxes, because if not, we can vote them out. Thank you.
You don't have to use all your time. Very good.
Good evening. John Green, 13368 Polo Road West. I'm really here just to speak on behalf of this topic, but really to give a little historical perspective. Mayor, I think you were the only one that sits up here tonight that was on the council when we made that decision to purchase the professional center. And I think it took a lot of foresight and vision looking ahead as we were looking at, I think we had already made the decision to relocate the tennis center. We had made the decision about building a new community center, and we were seeing the success of the amphitheater and some of the programming that was taking place on this campus, really. And so that decision was, we don't know what's going to happen with the professional center long term, but we knew that it was an important asset to acquire as we looked ahead. So whether it was the council that I was on, this council, future council, we don't know what that's going to look like, but I want, for the record, to be perfectly clear that the decision at that time when we made that purchase was to buy the professional center, not to operate it as an ongoing business in perpetuity, but to continue to operate it until we had a plan in place that allowed us to utilize that asset for the highest and best use. I think we're sitting here tonight sort of a victim of the success of what's gone on in this village and what's gone on this site. Tremendous success at the amphitheater. I mean, we're drawing 3,000 people plus to some of these events. Tennis has a dedicated facility where they can enjoy their sport and enjoy being with their peers. This is just another, I think, part of that evolution that we're seeing here on this site. I know at the time that night of the discussion about buying the professional center, there was a lot of pushback that we have no role as government stepping in and operating a private business and being a landlord. There are some great P3 programs and opportunities, I think, to work with private investors. Vice Mayor, you talked about some of the meetings that you've had. I work with investors in real estate, and we're always looking for kind of P3 opportunities where we can try to solve some of these problems and provide some value back to investors. Nobody wants to see businesses get displaced, but we do have to think about what's best as we look ahead, and especially on this site. So I guess my comments really are specific to, for the record, we never ever intended that we would operate the professional center as a landlord in perpetuity for this village. So I hope we can come together as a community. We can find the right team to put in place to find a solution for whether it's an incubator program or a place for small businesses to operate, maybe grow, or just operate whatever size that they're comfortable with. So it was an important purchase, and I think that we're seeing some opportunities here. But without that land acquisition at the time, and it was a land bank, I agree with you, Mayor, we'd find ourselves wanting to try to maybe buy that back at a much higher price than what we paid for it 4 or 5 years ago. So I know you guys have some tough decisions to make, but it's important that we remember why we did it and what's the best use for it. So thank you.
Thank you, former councilman. We appreciate your time and being here tonight. We don't see enough of you, so.
There's 2 more cards that have come in. Vincent Weber.
Vince Weber, are you here? Okay, you have to come up to this one only tonight. It's okay, we're glad to have you here. And the reason we are doing this one is because we are ADA compliant by offering the sign language in the back. So apologies, we're going to get some other things taken care of, so captioning will be current. But
in fact, we just voted earlier to do that.
We just voted earlier on the software to do that, so thank you, Vince. Okay, name and address, and you get 3 minutes.
Quick. Okay. I'm here to ask some questions, really, and examine things that perhaps the board hasn't really taken a good hard look at yet. seems to me we're putting the cart before the horse. Without a 10-year plan or any sort of long-term plan, what is going to be developed is going to be developed willy-nilly. It happens, I've seen it happen on numerous other occasions, not here too, but also in other parts of the country. Okay? So this is basically what I would like to propose tonight. And I've spoken incidentally to Mr. Odell, spent a lot of time with him today, and got some additional information that I think we needed to have to make sure that the facilities that we could use would be available. Said, how would you prioritize Wellington's needs over the next 10 years? That is housing, both for seniors and families. Does the plan call for when they will be built, where they will be built, what type of housing, single family, multifamily, townhouses? That's all what goes into a 10-year plan. What is going to be the tax impact of such development? What will be the costs? Also, has an analysis been done regarding the impact of the type of growth of business and other uses would we want to have in the community? You don't want to do something that's going to cut your nose off to spite your face. What type of PUD is designated AR/SE? I finally got that answer today. Okay. What type of businesses are allowed in that area? Because you've got an existing zoning call for that up in the area near the tennis courts. What municipal services currently exist at these locations? And who pays for them? Are there other possible alternatives? You know? You could relocate the attorneys and other service providers from their current lakefront site to the underutilized space here at City Hall. And it seems like the attorneys spend most of their time here anyway. Okay. And perhaps you'll even be able to increase your revenue a little bit. Construct a senior housing facility similar to Wingate at the current Fish and Pier combination. I thought about that, and I did a little more looking around, and I've changed my mind basically on that. I think you got an ideal location sitting here right behind Holiday Inn for housing of that type. They're only being used now intermittently for soccer and some other sporting events. Parking is there already.
I need you to wrap up, Vince.
Oh, okay, I'm
You're
sorry.
out of your time, but
Okay. Let me just summarize then. I've been involved in many projects of this type over the years, and in a number of nationally and internationally known developers. I know some that would be happy to come down here and take a look at some of these sites. I hear you got only, nobody wanted to talk to you about it. I have 2 or 3 who will, and who are capable of doing it and have a track record to prove it. Since only one proposal is under consideration at the moment, I would respectfully suggest that additional proposals be obtained. I am sure that any number of developers, be they local, regional, or national, would be interested, given the site and its location. If there's
Vince,
any
I'm
way
going
I
to
can
ask
help,
you.
please let me know.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask you to wrap up. Very good.
Yeah, so there's 2 more cards. Dolores Boshian. And then I have one.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Good evening, Dolores Boshin, 2157 Wingate Bend, here in Wellington, Mayfair. We acknowledge you're going to be building something, the residents of Mayfair. We appreciate your acknowledging us in this focus group or planning committee, whatever you're calling it. We want the town to know we understand what's happening, and we want you to know We're very concerned, and that's why we want to be a part of working with you. We are concerned with the property values of our homes because we are an over 55 community. We're concerned with our quality of life because it will be changing over the next 5 to 10 years during any development that you use and do. Our seniors have ailments, everything from COPD, high blood pressure, etc. And this construction, whether it be pile driving, pollution, etc., will cause people to be prisoners in their own home. We want to be part of it. We want to work with you. We want to go on record. We feel it's very important that this group's lifestyle be taken into consideration. And in addition to all of the tax ramifications, etc., they're living on fixed incomes. You know, we have to take all of this into consideration. And last but not least, when it comes to development and finding partners, I'd like to suggest you reach out to an organization called BOMA, Building Owners and Managers. They have offices in Fort Lauderdale. They are an international organization. They deal with everything from regulatory. Their members are in every part of the real estate business, and they can help you. I was formerly part of the organization in New Jersey. I have just been to their international conference in Miami 2-3 weeks ago. They're available to help you, and they will. If you'd like, I can be a liaison with them, or I can get you contact information. Thank you for hearing us. Thank you for considering us, and please keep us in the loop.
Thank you.
One more thing, I can tell you how important this is to us because we are seniors. It is a miserable night out there with the drain and the rizzle, and there are at least 12 of my neighbors here in the audience tonight.
More cards, Mr. Vice Mayor?
I have one last card, but this person does not wish to speak, so they did leave a comment, which I would be happy to read.
Okay.
It's Diane Souter, 12148 Monroe Street. I oppose and I do not wish to speak. I hope that the Village of Wellington will take into consideration your neighbors at Mayfair and the effect that we will be forced to endure. Noisy, privacy, traffic, crime, and our right for a peaceful living.
Okay, very well. Okay, that's it for public comment. Mr. Barnes, if you could go back and say what the ask is at this point so that we can get back on to understand what it is that staff is asking of us.
I will do that. And as I'm pulling that up, the one thing I do want to somewhat just address briefly, and can certainly do that and discuss it with any of the residents who are here at some other time, is one of the questions that's come up regularly, and I brought it up at the February 13th meeting that we had at the community center, is where did this start? How did this get started? And this is a staff directive. This is a staff process that we have brought to council for consideration. Nobody on council came up with any individual aspects of it. We basically came up with a concept, and over time, since 2017, when we started making presentations to council on the different options, different concepts, and we've been through several of them, what's driven that is our attempt to try and stay ahead of the curve, looking at all sorts of different trends that are out there. We wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't do that. Are we going to miss? Sure, none of us are all, we're not futurists, but we're going to do our best to get the information that's out there. And one of the things we look at are demographics. We look at national trends, we look at state trends, we look at local trends. We look at what's happening in suburban communities across the country and how they are dealing with the changes. One thing I brought up at yesterday's meeting that I'll just reiterate is that one of the things we've got to come to grips with is that changing demographic, age in particular, in that what drove a lot of suburban development over the last 30 or 40 years, that's changing. Not only in looking at uses and mixed uses in particular, which seem to be gaining in popularity, and in a lot of cases are driving property values up on adjacent properties nearby. But also one thing that we haven't looked at yet, but it's certainly something that we're a little bit, it's tougher for us to look at given that we're, to some extent, as many people in the past have said, a bedroom community, So we focus on changes that we can try and affect rather than changes that we can't. A lot of these changes that we're looking at or contemplating, not a single blade of grass is going to change on anyone's front yard, but it certainly will have some impact, and we're hoping positive impact. And that's what's generated that.
Mr. Barnes, I don't want you to feel like we're
Oh,
not
no.
appreciating the work. I mean, we do. I think that we've had great staff members, over the years. And part of the reason we're having this conversation now is because this site was not master planned
Right.
before. So we're back to the chicken or the egg thing. We got the egg, and now
The egg's doing
looking
really
for the
well.
chicken.
When we get
Yeah.
more chickens, absolutely.
So, but, and I don't mean to find fault, but because that's not what I'm here to do. What we're here to do is to go forward and looking at the fact that the council was elected, and I will answer Mr. Kopp's question about what are we doing up here and why would we not have a referendum on this. This is our job. We were elected to, make these decisions, and they're hard decisions sometimes, and sometimes they're not very popular, but if we feel strongly about it, that's what we're elected to do. And while I've sat on this council, we have spent money on tennis courts, we have spent money on the community center, we have spent a lot of the elements that we're talking about here, that's what we do. So for discussion about, and I think that we're agreeing that that's what we're elected to do, we have to establish the budget. All of this falls in line with that. That is our job. That's our job to do up here. And we want to do it well, and we want to do it with public input. This came from Directions Workshop. This plan that we've looked at as it's gone through, it's come from a Directions Workshop where staff sat with council and went through.
This council and the one before it?
Council, well, the one before it never really looked at and I'm giving you credit. I'm giving us credit for taking it on because it's harder. It's harder. The ones before it never looked at this entire site that I've been on since 2010.
No, but this discussion of a town center, I heard in the 2015 visioning of the should we do something? Should we start to think about this? I mean, this has been around for.
Well, it isn't just from visioning, though. We had a strategic 50-year plan that focused in on this property that said that this is a key.
Part of that is revisionistic
No, I know, but
history,
the future
Mr.
of Wellington, the future of Wellington, according to that report, is centered on this particular property. And the view, at least my read on that report, was in order for us to stay competitive as a community into the long-term future, we need to have a community gathering point. And we don't have anything like that at all. And this is the property that we should do it at. At least that was my read from the report.
This is the property that we own. This is what we own. This is what we control. So I can agree with that. But from the questions that I brought up at the very beginning about water uses, about noise, about those questions that I've had from the beginning, I still have those questions. And as we go forward and look at what we're doing here, I want to make sure that we are doing something that meets a need, that softens the blow for the neighboring residents. I don't want to have Harborside, which, Jupiter's having a difficulty with because the water carries sound. I don't want us. I want us to walk in with our eyes open, do something that we can do together as a council. I think we should master plan this site. I agree. But I think we need to do it in a little bit different method. I think we've gotten a lot of public input now, and we have something to start with, I think, at this point. But when it comes to the circulation, I agree. The boardwalk, I think, was something that everyone liked the idea, and access to the water. When we built the community center, we built it to activate the waterfront. We put a big round dock out back. It looks like a floating dock. It's really a patio. It's never been used. It's been rented 3 times in 2.5 years since we've opened it, almost 3 years since we've opened it. So what did we build it for? I think we need to look at the entire site in order to answer all those questions.
I do think that we need to clarify one thing. Mr. Weber was talking about housing. There's no consideration of housing.
That's correct.
On anything we're talking about here.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct.
Okay.
And he seemed to be talking about a different site, which, again.
But I just think it's important for clarity. It's just as to this particular issue, there's no component of planning for housing.
That's correct.
The recreation master plan that we just authorized a couple of meetings ago, how would that play into what we're looking at now? Would that be part of this discussion? If there are recreation uses here, is that going to play into what we're doing here on this site?
I think it's not going to play into this discussion necessarily, but this would play into the rec master plan. in terms of what evolves out of this, because in some cases, the rec master plan is I'll pick a number, 10,000 foot, 5,000 foot, not ground level. On this project, we're dealing with just a site. You know, and the adjacent property, whereas the master plan is going to look village-wide and in some cases factor in even county-wide and regional influences that affect the
So
demand
this
and
is the
supply.
egg and the recreation master plan is the chicken.
In some cases, sure, but the master plan even for this site might be a chicken, and the rec master plan is like the super chicken.
But they're gonna
Yeah.
interplay a certain amount.
There is.
Okay.
The interplay is going to be that the elements that we look at for this site, based on, and we're going to have to do some ground level discussion and assessment of what the needs are based on what we already have here. That'll play into the rec master plan when we're looking at the village-wide context to say, all right, so what services are we providing? What are our deficits? Where do we have excess? And how does that all fit together in the overall equation of programs and services and facilities?
So you think this is effective timing to move ahead with a master plan on this site while we're doing the recreation master plan?
Absolutely, because the return would be is that we'll be able to feed in if there's other facilities that seem to be getting considerable use elsewhere, and whether that patterns some of the uses here or complements it, we'll know.
Any other questions from council?
So how do you intend on this working? Are we going to go out and interview certain candidates and come up with a guy who gives us the most cost-effective price point for the service he's going to? How are we going to actually?
Are we going to post an RFP? Is there gonna,
Sorry.
Right.
So the CNA on this, it's a design professional.
Right. These services include the service of design professionals regulated by Florida state statute that governs registered professionals like engineers, architects, landscape architects, surveyors, et cetera. So we would be required to follow the Consultants Competitive Negotiation Act, which requires us to go out for a proposal that is qualifications-based. It is a qualifications-based selection. We provide a scope of services and some background and context for them to propose on, where we look at their qualifications, their experience, and in some cases, the approach to the project, not cost. And at the time, based on a review of the preliminary submissions that are received, we shortlist required by state statute a minimum of 3 firms, and interview a minimum of 3 firms. And based on the best firm that is evaluated by the staff selection committee, we would then move on to council and recommend approval of that. Ultimately, it's still council's final decision, given that it's a contract that we're signing, but it would be staff's recommendation, as we do with all consultant selections that meet the threshold requirements.
It's a regulated process that we'll follow properly.
Absolutely.
But the thing is, even if we get a master plan, it's gonna be similar to what we have here as far as circles and.
I'm going to say this.
It's not gonna be designed. We're not talking about design in this contract.
Well, I'm going to say this about that. The solicitation process would allow us to start at the planning phase, but that's the one benefit of actually going through the solicitation process, is that we're not doing this stop-and-go choppy design master planning process that we've tried to do both with some in-house expertise and some of the outhouse expertise under the threshold. And we're limited by that threshold that we can't retain somebody for more effort. This will allow us to do as little or as much as we need to without regard for that, because we will have gone through the CCNA process. So at some point in time, we'll get something more than just bubbles and stick drawings. We'll get a little more mathematized site plan so that we can start looking at
which elements we would want
elements and bleachers on a pool deck. We can look at parking spaces. We can look at more detail. And that's the intent, is that we start, again, general scale, but we're going to get a little bit more refined so we can make some better decisions. We don't expect you to make decisions strictly based on a bunch of bubble diagrams.
So that we can then work towards phases, prices, all of these kinds of things.
Correct.
One of the things that we clearly heard during the processes, especially the ones where the public were at, the roundtables and then the town hall meeting, was, look, nobody's telling us what time frames this is going to take. Nobody's telling us what the phasing is. Nobody's telling us what the costs are. Nobody's telling us how you're going to pay for it. We want to know how you're going to protect the businesses. We want to know what you're going to do to protect Mayfair and the other apartment complex next to us. We want to know what you're going to do. If you're planning on expanding the amphitheater, how are you going to do things like mitigate the sound, make sure that we don't have sound going out over the lake. Those are all the kinds of things that we're looking at doing here, finding things, is coming up with a plan, because this is not something that's going to happen this year or next year. It is a 10 or 15-year plan. It's going to take that long to evolve. No, there isn't going to be a whole series of things popping out of the ground this year or next year or even the year after. So what the public clearly said is find a way to protect the businesses, make sure that our properties are protected. We know that they want additional circulation. The boardwalk was something that really, that was really the only thing that we saw clear consensus on, because no matter what you do with that, it doesn't really affect anything, and if you don't have to relocate or dislocate anything to do that. But it was, tell us real costs, tell us real programs, take user inputs, do a real plan, not a disjointed plan, and that's what we're asking you to do tonight, is tell us, is give us the authority to do the RFP. That RFP has to come back to you. It will be back to you in about 60 days. And then we'd like to start looking into doing the boardwalk, because that is the only thing that's the only element of it that we can do that doesn't really impact any other element. So that's kind of where we're at. And Mr. Barnes, I love listening to Mr. Barnes, which I like trying not to talk too much.
But isn't there a third component? As Mr. Barnes laid it out, and then there's a third component, which is to look at ways to potentially use the funds that are in the Lake Wellington Professional Center Fund to look at other ventures or locations or partnerships where these small businesses could succeed potentially better than where they are currently.
Exactly, because the simple fact is you cannot go out and create a brand new building today that will come in at the same exact price point that Lake Wellington Professional Center is. And in fairness to some of the comments that were made, the building is not ADA compliant today. It does not need to be unless and until we do improvements that exceed 1/3 of its value. We have known that. We have never hidden that. That is not something that we've ever said. Even when we gave council the cost estimates a couple of months ago, one of the questions came up is that are all of these absolutely necessary? And even that list of projects, some of them are listed as discretionary. So we heard very clearly the businesses are important to us. And from a staff perspective, what we believe about businesses are Wellington is about 96% residential. Every business place that we have and every business that we have is precious to us. We know that. We're not looking to displace anybody. And the idea was presented, take some of the money that's currently in the Lake Wellington Professional Center Fund and use that as a way to do a public-private partnership that allows those businesses to relocate, that provides a service that isn't anywhere else. And and that's part of the reason it's on the table. And the member of this council that presented to me certainly knows who it was. And I think it's a good idea. But I also know that we cannot get to the point where we're looking at a serious plan if we don't do one. And that has been one of the criticisms along the way, is that we haven't done the planning. We've done this piecemeal. We haven't taken a whole look at it. And what you're seeing in the 4 plans that you were looking at, those are not. Jim and I had a conversation at one point when we started looking at this into this many, many months ago. It comes back to our private sector days. Our comment was, any resemblance between the final configuration of this building and one of those bubble plans is purely coincidental. We now need to get away from doing bubble things and go to a reality that you can consider and make actual real decisions on.
And I think that's what's so important. And to the mayor's point at previous meetings and tonight, and to Mr. Barnes's point, is the totality of the site hasn't been master planned. It's kind of evolved piecemeal. That's why there's lack of interconnectivity between different elements of it. And it's time to finally look at this site as a whole and try to master plan and retrofit what we can to see how this site can better work together into the future to benefit the most number of people as possible, while respecting the fact that we have businesses nearby that need some place to work, while we have a age 55 and older community right next door that's going to want to make sure they're not negatively impacted by whatever happens. But the time to do a master plan is, we missed a window earlier, but now's the time to put together a master plan as to what this site can look like, what it can do, how it can provide the most benefit to the most residents, and what it would cost. And that's what I think we're looking at tonight to try to figure that out. I do think the boardwalk is something everyone does like. My only concern is I don't want to build a boardwalk element that we're going to find out after the fact, well, we did it, now we don't really want to, now we're going to want to add land and push it out. So I have a little concern about trying to do, again, another piecemeal part of this without having the whole master plan. And I do think that this can run in tandem with the Parks and Rec master plan, because they're going to be going out and talking to, you know, the heavy users of the aquatic center, the more residents, to get a more statistically relevant sampling than what we've gotten at the surveys at the events. Even the town meetings we've had, still, there's 100 people there. That's still not, you know, a representative sample of 66,000. So, you know, we do need that engagement. We need a design professional to come in, look at the site, see what you can do, and more importantly, see what you can't do, and turn this into something that will benefit all of us. And again, we're not looking for Harborside. I don't think anyone up here wants Harborside or wants City Place, but we do want to continue to find ways to make a great Wellington better than it is. And I think this is the right step forward for that process.
There's just one thing before we go on, and I apologize. The boardwalk, any iteration that showed that way out into the lake is I don't want to call it fanciful interpretation, but the simple fact is we're not going to be filling in a lot of the lake no matter what we do with that boardwalk, because we've got regulatory requirements, both state and federal, compensating storage requirements. So it's going to be pretty close to where the shoreline is today, no matter what we do.
It was a significant investment to change any of that, which is one of the things I said right out of the gate also. So I think we're at a good place. If there's no further comment, I think we've given direction.
I just want to say,
Oh, I'm
I
sorry.
agree that now is the time to master plan. I mean, clearly there's major interest in using the site, as we're struggling to make it happen now, and the village staff is really great at utilizing all the space that we have, whether it's Parks and Rec or this site. But now I feel like it's getting to be a struggle to use, and so now is a good time to master plan it so we can make decisions, because we really can't say whether something will work or not until we do this process. So that's all I wanted to add.
Yeah.
I apologize, I didn't.
Oh, that's okay.
No, I want to say that I've, since I first spoke about being appointed to this council in 2015 and through the election in 2016 and the election again in 2018, I have said that I thought it was important that we look at where we've come from and where we're going. And I think that we have to be mindful that as we reach build out, we have neighborhoods and communities and now a city to our north and potentially more coming to our west that can do newer, quicker, bigger, faster things than maybe we can do. And villages, cities, municipalities that haven't considered that when they were similarly positioned have gotten passed by. And this council, this staff, and prior councils have had the courage to say Wellington is going to face tough decisions and is going to do what it can to be current. And I think that the former vice mayor said it, foresight, vision, looking ahead. Councilman Napoleon said it correctly just a moment ago. How do we take Great Wellington and make it better than it is? The fact is that looking at, studying all of what we're doing in regards to the Parks and Rec Master Plan, looking at and going forward with the fields plan at the high school, looking at moving, if and when the time comes to do something with the pool, do we move it to the high school? Planning this facility or this property with clear attention to both the neighboring residents and to the Lake Wellington Professional Center. My law firm, my current law firm we began there for about a year and outgrew it. But the fact is, it is an important facility, but it is not at the quality and level that a normal village facility would be at. So looking at these three things that we're being asked to do tonight is the right thing for the future of Wellington. I think that it is important that we make sure that we are trying to stay ahead of the curve. And I think that's what this staff challenges us to do. I think that's the obligation we have to our residents. And I think that that's what this council struggles with every day. The mayor said it correctly. Decisions are not supposed to all be easy. Sometimes decisions are hard, but making decisions is what we have to do, and we have to do them with the absolute commitment that we are trying to do the right thing for all of our residents and their futures in this village. So I think that these three things that we're being asked to look at tonight are important questions, and I think we should say yes to all of them.
Let me quickly add to that point. And again, at a lot of I went to all the meetings except for the one where I was hospitalized. So I think that was a good excuse to not be there. But I do think a comment I heard a couple times was if it's not broken, you don't have to fix it. But that's the wrong thinking. You can't wait till something's broken to fix it. You've got to have some foresight and see what's coming. And we do know there's a lot more, just look what's happening to our west. There's going to be newer developments, new homes, new amenities, bigger amenities, better amenities, that's going to drive those prices up, and we might be a stopover community to the west. We have the equestrian, no one else has that. But we have to make sure that we are doing things to stay relevant and keep our property values up by improving what we already have. So you can't wait till something's broken to fix it. You've got to make sure you keep developing and building on what you've already got to improve it in a way that maximizes the benefit to all the residents. And that's, I think, what Councilman said.
In answer to that, Councilman Napoleon, one thing that's bothered me about a lot of the events we've done is they actually attract people to the neighboring communities around us. When we create that center of activity, it's actually a benefit to our neighboring communities because they're free events and everybody comes in. And I like that. I want people to come here and be a part of it. But as we look at these elements, I want to make sure that we're not creating something that's actually attracting more people to live in Arden or Westlake.
Arden's really far away. They tell you they won't. They're really far west.
Yeah, and I've been to both of them, and honestly, there's nothing like Wellington. There really isn't. We are unique, and the reason that we all care so much about it and have had these kinds of discussions and arguments and disagreements and agreements is because of that. But in fact, I want to make sure that we do something that benefits our residents. And that's where I keep coming back to the question of making sure we're not making something that attracts people to live in the communities around us, because now they have this epicenter of adventure here. So, as we move forward, I think we're on the right track. I think we're in agreement about it. We're not necessarily in agreement about how we got here, but we don't have to be. What we have to be is moving forward, how are we going to do this as a team? And I do think our staff has done a very good job and tried to, deal with disagreements and all of these kinds of discussions. But again, I think we need to go with it. We need to go ahead and give direction. I think we've done that.
I think in this case, a vote might be in order.
Okay.
So a vote on the
A
entire.
motion
Can I
to
give
move
you
forward.
what we're looking, for the specific
Sure.
direction we're looking for?
Please.
We're
Give
looking
them to
for-
us one at a time, Mr. Schofield, and then
I'm
we'll.
going to do that.
That's
We're looking for specific direction to A, develop a town center plan, including planning, design, and component cost estimates. Move forward with the design and construction of the boardwalk along Lake Wellington, as this is an element that does not require other site changes and does not dictate the design of any other component.
I'm going to disagree with your second statement
Okay.
of design because we're still in master planning stage.
All right. Consider utilizing the proceeds from the leasing of the Lake Wellington Professional Center for a public-private partnership to provide comparable alternative office spaces for businesses in Wellington currently housed in the Lake Wellington Professional Center. Initiate user group meetings with affected groups such as Mayfair residents, aquatics patrons, and professional center, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. And then develop phasing plans and budgets for council to make specific yes/no decisions with.
I would suggest we go through those one by one because we haven't.
Well, I think there's
I
more.
think
I think Mr.
it's-
Schofield just added more to that than the three questions Mr. Barnes gave us originally.
Well, those are the ones I had written in the agenda item.
Well, I think
Who's
tonight,
combining?
we have consensus to move forward with the master plan on the site and the boardwalk. Is that where we're at, basically?
And to authorize the staff, to look at options for using the money that is in the Lake Wellington Professional Center Fund to explore public-private partnerships and other ventures for what may go forward, either whether it be at the Lake Wellington Professional Center or elsewhere. Those are
You're
the three
taking
decisions.
me down too many rabbit trails on that one,
Those are the three
Councilman.
questions that Mr. Barnes gave us at the beginning. They're still the same three questions.
If you were talking about taking the Lake Wellington Fund and investing it, you've already made a decision to take the building down. So that's where you got me.
That's not the way I interpreted it. What I interpreted was we were authorizing staff to explore options using that money. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. I would imagine if they come up with some sort of a plan, it's obviously going to be presented to us. And then at that point, we can decide,
That's right.
yeah, that's not a bad plan, or no, we don't like that at all, that's terrible. And of course, the residents can weigh in, no, we don't want to use
I'm
that money for
hoping
that.
that staff is already able to accomplish some of those things without this vote.
But I
we're
don't think
talking
I don't
about
think they're
now-
doing that. That's why Mr. Barnes gave us that question at the beginning.
Right, basically, what we've got is we have the money that's been set aside. And at this point, assuming that we're moving forward with the master planning for the site, it would be short-sighted to go ahead and spend those on the actual capital improvements. So at this point, we would maintain status quo in terms of the way we've been handling the, we'll say, operational maintenance, capital maintenance on the facility, on Lake Wellington Professional Center. But at the same time, since we're not expending those capital funds for a re-roof or any other major capital improvements, we should evaluate the alternative if we want to look at dedicating those funds and any future funds until such time that it either becomes necessary for capital improvements, or that we decide that we're going to take that facility down, to go ahead and evaluate the feasibility of looking at substitute alternative space, either in the vicinity or elsewhere in Wellington.
For using all of the money that's in that fund, part of it, I think the staff should
We
We
would
really
have
don't
a
have-
vote on that. We would have a vote on that expenditure. You
Oh, no,
wouldn't-
no, absolutely. This is,
occurred.
you're basically, we're looking for direction that you want us to do that.
Yes.
I'm very careful to not want to go down the road and realize that I didn't know where I was going.
Would it be helpful if Mr. Barnes restated the three decision points that he's asking you to vote on?
We can do that, but just so we're clear, and it's not in conflict with Mr. Schofield mentioned, the two last bullets that I'm going to mention are actually part of Develop the Town Center Master Plan. So the 5 bullets that you have as decision points, I summarized into 3. Develop a Town Center Master Plan to include planning, design, and component cost estimates. Part of that includes the last 2 bullets, which are initiate user group meetings with affected groups such as Mayfair Aquatics Facility patrons and professional center tenants, and the other bullet, which is develop phasing plan and budget.
That's all one
That
thing.
team would do all of that.
Okay. Let's
And
vote
it
on
starts
that
with the
one.
master
Let's
planning,
stop
but
right
just
there
to-
and vote on that
but
one.
Just to be clear, because I heard there was a little bit of concern on the mayor's part, including planning, design, and component cost estimates. Basically, the reason I want to include that is so that at some point, regardless of whether we do a garbage can or any major improvement, whatever is in that master plan, I don't want to have the stop-and-go approach, and having gone through the solicitation, I want to include, should we need to go to construction documents, that we can go there. And that's why I included that in the bullet. It wasn't at all to try and say, we're going straight to construction documents. We're going to start at planning, but I want to have the ability to do that so that then I don't have to bring in yet another consultant to start over because I didn't identify it in that scope of services.
Right.
So that's bullet number 1, including the last 2 bullets. Second.
So I would suggest we vote on that one.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
I would move that we affirm what Mr. Barnes just said and move forward with hiring the consultant as stated.
I'll second that.
And that's for advertising and all of that.
Right, and it'll be back to you in about 60 days because staff can't do that. You have to do it.
Right, we have to award that.
Right.
So before I go forward on this, I just want to make it clear that there are a lot of moving parts with looking at community-wide directions workshops. I have a lot of ideas I'd like to share with you guys that we can't really do under normal conditions. We have to have a time we can do that. And a lot of those things might affect us. But I'm confident that this is all going to move forward with a lot of public input and a lot of all of our best interests. So I don't not support this. I do support us moving forward with a master plan. But again, none of this is happening in a vacuum. And when we talk about the 10-acre site that Mr. Weber brought up for housing or performing arts, or we talk about investment in the community, of spending tax dollars in a way that does have an ROI for the community. None of that happens at this town center site. It happens community-wide. So I'm hoping that we can have all those conversations, but I think all of it's going to play into what we do here.
Absolutely.
You have a pending motion?
And there was a second?
Yes.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously.
All right, bullet number 2, I think I've got the flow now. Move forward with the design construction of a boardwalk along Lake Wellington as this element that does not require any other site changes and does not dictate the design of any other component.
It would include floating docks?
Right, basically at this
We're going to
point-
work on that. I mean,
Right,
all
we
of
would-
that part.
What we envision for that is that since we want to move forward with that as expeditiously as possible, we would bring in an annual consultant and utilize an annual consultant with the appropriate sub-consultant team to go ahead and design that. And of course, that has, even though it's just one element, it will have a planning component that will get a concept before they actually put, hard designs together. We're going to have some concept that's going to look at the existing docks that are there that are utilized by the Florida Rowing Center and the shells versus the need and desire that's been voiced by boaters in the community to have some kind of docking facility to be able to utilize the town center
pontoon.
property to be able to come from the lake, and looking at also other lake uses that would be impacted by the boardwalk. So I think it would require a little bit of a planning effort, but still part of that separate process.
Okay, and I would move that we move forward with the planning, design, and construction of the boardwalk along Lake Wellington as further explained by Mr. Barnes.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, hearing none, motion
Nay.
passes unanimously.
I still think,
I'm sorry.
I'm a nay on that. I still
Okay.
like waiting to master plan the whole thing before we do the boardwalk piecemeal. I understand we probably can do it, but I'd rather see the whole thing at once, so I'm a no on that one.
Well, I think on that issue, when they bring the plan to us, we'll question them on how that is this something that potentially could prohibit future options? And
I'm sorry, I
going to
shouldn't
be-
have moved to the vote without discussion, Councilman Napoleon. And that was part of the discussion,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think Councilman Napoleon makes a good point there on that. But I at this point, I think because there was general consensus that people want a boardwalk, I think we can at this point move forward with at least
That too will not be
Receiving
done in
it.
a vacuum.
Yeah, receiving a plan, and then
That's
we look
exactly
at it,
what I-
and then we can decide at that point, are we premature, or
Right,
is
we're
this?
not going to be, we're not voting on a boardwalk right now. We're
Right.
voting on
Right,
moving
which is
ahead
why
with
that
it.
I added the word planning
Design.
into the bullet points.
So, and
Thank you.
the discussion that I brought, I don't know if it makes any sense. I just want to make sure that if there's a way to mitigate the sound, that we explore it. I mean, and that's
Sure.
part of this too. So, okay, that vote stands 4-1. All right.
And
The
the
third
last-
element,
Bullet item, last element that requires a vote, would be consider utilizing proceeds from leasing of the Lake Wellington Professional Center for a public-private partnership to provide comparable alternative office space for businesses in Wellington currently housed at the Lake Wellington Professional Center.
And I would move that we give staff that authorization exactly as stated by Mr. Barnes.
Well, wait, staff, and here's the reason why I say it that way. Because, in 3 different groups of meetings, that's been thrown at me, and I've said, I don't have any authority to say whether or not that's even an option. And
Okay, I
so
want to clarify here. What you're giving us is the ability to explore options. Any decision that we made in terms of expending those funds is not a staff decision, it's a policy decision that
Right,
comes back to council.
I'm talking
I
about the
don't
authority
think
to
this
explore
vote
it. That's
needs to be
exactly right.
made. I think they already have that authority to explore. I mean, I don't know that this vote needs to be made, but, because you guys have assignments.
Well, I think in the interest of rumor control and transparency, to make sure that somebody doesn't think that Barnes decided that this was a good idea to go ahead and drop that building and let's use the money for someplace else. Perhaps that was the basis for looking for some direction, just to make sure that we at least had the consensus from council that you want us to explore that rabbit hole.
And for the purpose of expressing that consensus, that we want you to do that, or to have the village do it.
I don't
think
think that
that's-
this calls for a vote, but I'm certainly willing to tell you to go do your job.
Okay.
Um,
Not the
vote on
first time. Everybody just jump on in.
That one, we would simply need consensus on. Hearing no objection, we're going to go do that.
Very well. All right.
All right, I think that brings
We
us
have-
to the end of this item, and then to the final item on the regular agenda, which is a discussion of the homeland annexation. So, Mr. Barnes, I believe this one is you as well.
Yeah, I'll keep my friends up here with me, but I may need a cut man here before I'm done, but
Not looking
we're going to
forward
give
to
this a shot. And-
Slides.
Ms. Cohen will be also tag teaming this with me as some of the information on this item she'll be able to shed some additional light on. So this item is the homeland annexation, and I figured we'd start as clearly as possible. The exhibit you have before you gives you an idea of where homeland is in relation to the village of Wellington incorporated limits, Wellington being blue and homeland being yellow. So generally located off of 50th, adjacent to Section 34, is the contiguous area to the village limits. And what's been requested, and we've been working on it over the last couple of years, as I mentioned yesterday at agenda review, is that the homeland community, in addition to other communities, has routinely over the last, since I've been here 15 years, and even before that, routinely come in and ask staff to consider annexation. They've asked questions. We provided data back and forth. The last request, as I mentioned, came approximately a couple of years ago, and maybe a little bit less than that. And since that time, we've been working back and forth, and primarily Ms. Quickle and I and Ms. Cohen, but mostly Ms. Quickle and I have been providing information back and forth to the community representatives, residents, and we've answered both residents' questions, board members' questions, residents in support of annexation, residents against annexation, and provided the same information. And over time, what's transpired is I've been in attendance with Mr. Basehart at one of their homeowners association meetings that was also coincident with their annual vote. And we also had a residents meeting here at the Village Hall and provided information related to annexation, general questions about impacts of zoning as it relates to existing development and new development within homeland and how that would be impacted by annexation and incorporation into the village. And at this time, we had received a few weeks back official request from their representative, Jeff Kurtz, who's representing the board of the Homeowners Association, who is representing that they've generally polled their association and they are wishing to be considered for annexation within the village. And at this point, what we have before you is that concept, together with Ms. Cohen, I believe, provided today an updated annexation agreement that reflects basically the roadmap that would be ensuing should the council move forward with the agreement and the consideration of annexation. This doesn't start the actual annexation public hearing process. This just starts the concept that we would move down the road toward that as outlined in the agreement. Just as a summary, and Ms. Cohen, jump in if I leave anything out, these are the steps taken to date as far as receiving the letter of interest from Homeland and receiving a draft annexation agreement, and as of today, having the latest revised annexation agreement that was reviewed by both the HOA board, their representative, and our legal staff.
All of this without a vote from council, for the record.
And that's generally
it's your job to go out and get this information.
It's amazing, but the next steps need a requirement and need us to actually come before council. So basically, these are the next steps that would happen, assuming council votes affirmatively to approve the agreement as well as the concept of annexation of homeland. Facilities report to be prepared by engineer and submitted to the village for our review and approval. Association members would vote on dissolution of the association and amended declaration. Those are outlined in the annexation agreement as to what steps they would be taking. And as part of our process to get the annexation considered through our respective committees, the Equestrian Preserve Committee based on the location of the property, the Planning, Zoning, and Adjustment Board because they consider all actions related to planning, zoning, and also ultimately council. So those would be 4 public hearings before you even get to the final approval for the zoning that would be in place, the land use approvals that would be in place, is we would prepare an annexation report that would meet the requirements of Chapter 171 Florida statutes. And at that point, then we would be considering as I mentioned, we'd be going to the Equestrian Preserve Committee, the Planning, Zoning, Adjustment Board, and council for land use rezoning and the annexation. And then second reading and final reading of the annexation ordinance presented to council. At that point, that is the trigger in the process that then requires, based on the type of project that this is not a single property owner. So this follows the uniform method of annexation that requires it to go to a referendum of the resident electors located within homeland. And the requirement based on Chapter 171 Florida statutes is such that resident electors are eligible to vote. That vote is held, and the majority plus one, basically 50% plus one, simple majority, is required to pass that annexation. And it's based on those that actually vote, as opposed to the total complement of registered electors. Assuming that that passes, then it would come back for the village to develop the local ordinance related to the other parts of the consideration that's in the annexation agreement, which is Homeland has determined that they believe they would want to pursue being created as a special unit, a separate unit of development of ACME, for the purposes of having the maintenance that is currently handled by the homeowners association handled by ACME through an actual assessment, since those remain private improvements. And the procedures of the special district, as well as case law, allows for the maintenance of those facilities by a public entity if we have some type of easement interest or interest in those properties, and that's also part of the requirements. Next, we would jump into creation of the ACME unit and the process that is required for that, and as far as assessments, et cetera, and those are all throughout, set forth throughout our ACME governing legislation and governing procedures. And all that would have to occur prior to the, actually what would have to happen is the annexation would have to be finally adopted, and then we would actually then create the ACME unit, so that then we would already be, they would be in the village, and then the ACME unit would be created to transact that business that they require, which is having the maintenance performed by the ACME Improvement District. And then lastly, we would consider any related items, like the one item that's identified in the annexation agreement specific to waterways within homeland, because that's something that otherwise would fall under our general rules, which they had indicated based on their review of that they would want something a little different. That's one change to our local ordinances. And that's that. Ms. Cohen, did I leave anything out?
No, I think you covered it.
Awesome.
Do we have a presentation from Homeland involved in?
We have representatives from Homeland here, as well as I think we might have some cards coming in.
And just so that you're aware and the public's aware, the annexation agreement, we did provide you with our revised comments to that. I believe it has been accepted by the association's board, the proposed revisions. And staff is comfortable that the agreement sets forth the proper process and in a proper form for you to consider and possibly approve tonight.
Madam Mayor, before the Homeland representatives, I have some questions for staff.
Sure.
How long does this process take? I mean, what's the timeline for this process to go from, yes, let's move forward, to the residents have a vote to annex themselves into Wellington?
It differs depending upon a couple of different scenarios, but generally speaking, this could take anywhere from 6 to 9 months or even longer. A couple of critical items are in there is that you've got to allow for certainly the advertising and notice of the public hearings.
And there's at least 4 of those?
There's at least 4, just to get us to the end where we actually then have to consider the final adoption of the land use and zoning approvals. But the key thing that actually drives a lot of the schedule is ultimately for the annexation is a referendum required that's actually run by the supervisor of elections. So there's an entity that isn't in the room today that we would have to coordinate with, both from our end and also from the Homeland HOA end. And ultimately, in some cases, that can drive your schedule longer or shorter, depending on their ability to accommodate the required dates. Since unless you schedule yourself within a general election, a special election would require them to agree to that actual date. So that's the one thing, and we've been back and forth, but as you might expect, given some of the turmoil there in the last few months, it's been difficult to receive any kind of confirmation.
And there are also public hearing requirements associated with forming the unit of development and that sort of thing. So it is not a quick process. but we're not able to definitively say for you tonight, well, it's going to take 6 months or it's going to take 8 months. Those things will unfold as we move through this process.
That's fine for now. We can hear from.
Go ahead, thank you.
Hi, Jeff Kurtz. I represent the Homeland Property Owners Association with respect to this annexation issue. We have been in discussions with the staff, sometimes more intensely and sometimes it slowed down, over the past over a year. And it has come together and mainly because of your staff's efforts to provide a mechanism for the accommodation that the board thinks is going to be necessary for that area to annex into Wellington. And we start off with the idea that the board believes it's in the interest of the community now to dissolve their association if they're going to come into Wellington. And as a part of that dissolution process, they would rid themselves of the declaration of covenants and restrictions. And so this agreement puts forth a roadmap, if you will, so that the parties can look at this and say, okay, this is the reasonable expectation of what is going to happen if we go down this road. The first step is, from Homeland's perspective, once they have this agreement in place, they'll be able to go to their membership and they'll say, there would be life after the association is dissolved, so make a decision, and it requires 2/3 of the property owners to make that affirmative decision to consent to the dissolution and eliminate the declaration. Now that dissolution and the elimination of the declaration is going to be contingent upon the steps that are outlined in the agreement, which is the annexation and the replacement of the service provider from being the Property Owners Association to ACME. So you've got a list of steps that need to be taken. We need to have something here to get everybody started. We've got the same chicken and egg problem that you were talking about with the last item. And this is not a final commitment on anybody's part because you have to have the vote of the membership. You have to have your analysis, your staff do the analysis on the annexation report and make sure that all the requirements of Chapter 171 are met. That'll be presented to you after receiving the facilities report from the HOA. And from then to give people some assurance as to what the direction would be after annexation. We provided for consideration up to first reading before the council on the land use and the zoning requirements. And then as your staff indicated, there's 2 hearings with respect to the annexation. So you have a minimum of 4 public hearings where these things are going to be discussed, or I should say public hearing dates. There'll be multiple items that'll be subject to the public hearing process. So everybody on both sides will be very well informed as to the positives, and I'm sure people might bring up some negatives about coming in. But this is a mechanism to get us to move forward, and without that, we're still standing in limbo. The importance of considering the agreement tonight is the board would like to put forth the package immediately after this meeting, give it to the membership while they are still in that remnant of this year's season. If it doesn't get done now, the concern is that they wouldn't present it until December and we'd be another year down the road. So that's what we're here for. There are 4 board members here. They provided cards. They're willing to take questions if you have any. I don't want to drone on. When you've seen the letter, you've seen the agreement. The agreement is based on the letter, so it was an attempt to memorialize that. If you've got any questions for me, I'll be happy to.
Any questions for
address
Mr. Kurtz, or would you like to move on?
Mr. Kurtz, I have a couple quick questions.
Sure.
All the is it your understanding, as it's been told to us by staff, that all of the costs for this process are essentially going to be borne by the Homeland HOA?
Well, there is an immediate cost for a facilities engineering report that the HOA is going to provide. There is a cost when you get to the unit of development of an engineering report and study that has to be done, and the HOA is willing to reimburse those expenses. There are costs associated with the referendum election involving the superintendent of elections or the supervisor of elections. And the statute says the village has to bear those costs, but we're willing to provide an equivalent amount of money for those. Those costs are going to be borne by the HOA. All the costs associated with your staff in preparing the ordinances, advertising the various ordinances that are out there, it's the village that is going to bear those costs.
As we do in the normal course of every
when you're dealing with
item.
Every agenda item, yeah.
Okay.
So,
Any other, we want to hear from the,
I have a question. Is that HOA reimbursement of the cost of the referendum in this agreement?
yes.
Yes.
Okay. I didn't see in the agreement, I only got this tonight, when it talks about contingencies, and I know we're talking about doing a facilities assessment, is there anything in this agreement that allows the village to say, we've assessed the facilities, it would cost us more than we thought to bring them to Wellington standards, we're not willing to do it at that cost? Is there something like that in this agreement? I didn't see that contingency.
There's not that specific language, but what you have is you're going to get a facilities report, and then you're going to provide, then your staff is going to provide an annexation report. At that time, they may or may not have identified the cost that would be associated with those improvements. And at some point, at any point in time, from the annexation report to the actual adoption of the annexation ordinance, you're going to be able to make a decision, no, we don't want to go forward with that. But remember that what we're contemplating is a unit of development under ACME to provide an assessment just on this community, on those lots, to maintain and, if necessary, make improvements to the facilities. So while you all may make a decision that you can't do it or don't want to do it, the actual cost of any of those improvements would be borne by the community through an assessment process when it became necessary. You're going to assess them on an annual basis, or I should say, the ACME will, through the unit of development, assess them on an annual basis for their budget.
So much like they're paying their HOA dues now, we would assess them to reimburse the village for the cost of maintaining their roads and facilities and other things like that. Okay.
And, you know, after the, on 2020, if we can get this done before January 1st of 2020, you'll put them on, in all likelihood, you'll collect that through the uniform tax bill.
And just as additional clarification for that, Mr. Napoleon, we're not bringing them to Wellington standards. Basically, they remain private, so we will not be completing a complete assessment wherein we compare them to existing codes and requirements, and if they meet, then we take it. If they don't meet, we either bring them up to standards or don't. We're taking them as is, and the intent would be to maintain them at the level of service that the residents they have now, that the residents desire. Should they choose to lower that level of service or increase that level of service, that's going to be a year-to-year budgetary decision that they would make as part of the budget process, the way we.
Who would be there making that decision
what
then?
I'm-
Well, since they're a specific unit of development, it is something that, just like we have Acme meetings, we would have a unit of development meeting to do that budget on a yearly basis.
And it would be, you all
The
would take,
homeowners.
you all would take input on
As the Acme board.
as the Acme board, and you would make those decisions as you do for all the rest of Acme.
Right, but in regard, so
So they
absent
could
some
make a
change,
request, they could make a request for an
change the
element,
level of service.
Correct.
Yeah.
and we would decide or
What the,
not?
what the agreement contemplates is that the level of service will be equivalent to the current level of service.
Correct.
So not adding other facilities, not taking
Right.
facilities away, kind of
But,
right there.
but keeping them the same, that you would operate a guardhouse with a gate at their entrance, that the roadways would be maintained, as they are now, that the drainage easements would be maintained in the same way, and that the bridle trail easements.
But
would
if
be-
they decided
They could,
down the road that they wanted a higher level of service, then that's something you could do, but they're paying for that.
Right.
So
yeah.
it's not something that would be borne by the taxpayers of Wellington or other landowners within Acme.
But my issue is with the phrasing there. It's not if they decided, it's if the Acme board decided, and we would then
Correct.
just be charging them for that. We
Yes.
could make that decision, or the Acme board, whoever that might be at the time, could make that decision, and they're agreeing that they would pay that based on the decision of that board.
You're
Correct.
correct. But the floor would be at its existing level.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct, but when you say if they decided they ceases to exist, essentially.
Well, the
and
landowners
Acme board-
still exist, and they could request it as part of the annual
Landowners meeting.
Okay, so there would
But that would
be
be, but that would be, still be just part of the Acme landowners meeting. It would, there's not gonna be some,
There would be a separate budget adopted, just since it's an actual separate unit of Acme, we could identify that as a separate item.
It would probably be at the same meeting,
But it would be broken out.
broken out as a separate item.
How you would see this is, as you go through your budget process, there are actually two budgets that we adopt. We do the assessment budgets in August, and this will be done as a part of the August budgets because they're assessments. Then you do the general fund budgets in September. So this would be, as you do that the Acme hearing in August, there would be a separate part that has a unit of development and it would have a line item for what that expense is, and that would be broken down by category.
Yeah. And the folks in that unit of development would get specific notice that the budget is going to be considered on, this particular evening, and they would be able to come and, as I said, most probably you're going to put it on that same night that you consider the Acme,
other
the solid
Acme.
waste, and all the others.
It would be most
But-
comparable to how Saddle Trail is done now, because you see that, we list that as a separate assessment based on the benefits and services, their debt right now, but you would have a separate one that would be identified for Homeland, but it would be running parallel with Acme and Saddle Trail as well, be presented on the same schedule.
And because it's a 298, it's governed that way. All right, I think we're ready to hear from, and just so that the residents know, we don't usually do question and answer. Is there a desire from this council to ask questions of the speakers that come up? If we-
Not for me at this point. I mean, depending on what they say, but maybe
Okay.
not.
Okay, all right, well, it's generally not our procedure, so we generally.
I don't think,
Yeah.
I think the way they filled out their cards was, they support, they identified who they were, and they indicated that if the board has questions, they'll be happy to respond.
Okay.
I mean, if the council has questions, they'll be happy.
Because you asked the board
Some of them
members-
don't have very good penmanship, for the
What officers of the
record.
board are here, Mr. Curtis?
Excuse me?
What officers of the board are here?
You have the
can
president
read
of
the
the board, Mr. Charlie Weiss. You have the secretary, Ellen Warritt. You've got.
Could you ask the board members just to raise their hands, please?
Sure.
And residents as well.
2, 3, 4, okay.
Okay.
Okay. So we do have some cards, so let's go ahead and call them up, or they wish to speak.
Well, there
Mr.
was
Vice
only-
Mayor, what do you have?
Yeah, there's only one card that was clear that they wish to speak, and then there were some that are not so clear. So I'll just,
Okay.
the first one who was clear was Amy Beller. Sorry, Miss Beller.
Good evening, everyone. I'm the secretary of the HOA Board of Homeland. I am a resident of Homeland, former resident of the Village of Wellington. I would like to be a resident of the Village of Wellington again.
And name and address for the record, if you don't
Amy
mind.
Beller, 5348 Cattail Circle, Lake Worth, Florida. If you haven't been to Homeland, and I don't know if you have, I would encourage you to come and check us out. It is a unique, beautiful, amazing community. I have fulfilled my lifelong dream of having my horses in my backyard. At Homeland, I have 2 large horses, 2 minis. It is a wonderful place to have horses, and we believe that Homeland and Wellington are a perfect match. Our hope is that we will be favorably received by this council. We would like to move quickly, as Mr. Kurtz had suggested. Our hope is to get our package out to our community for their consent to move forward with this process. We need 2/3 of the lot owners in Homeland to agree, and we want to catch people before they leave town. And be able to sit down and have a cup of coffee and discuss the positives and the negatives with people face to face, rather than trying to track people down on the phone. And so that is the exigency from our standpoint, is that we would like to get our package out by the end of the week, frankly, so that we can begin this next step in what's been a very arduous process for us. We've all been working very hard. Your staff has been working very hard, and let me just thank Mr. Barnes and Mr. Schofield for all of their assistance. Thank you.
Okay, and so the following 3 all have indicated they support, but they didn't check whether they wanted to speak or not. The first is Charlie Weiss.
I usually don't use a microphone. Usually you can hear me anyway. My name is Charlie Weiss. I live at 11878 Hawk Hollow over in Lake Worth and Homeland as well. I'm the president of the HOA. I'd like to thank Mr. Barnes, Mr. Schofield, and Ms. Cohen too as well, because it's been an arduous process just to be able to get to where we are with you this evening. You know, I started this a couple of years ago when I first moved up here. We had a kind of a adversarial relationship in our community, and I've been on the board twice, this time as the president, and one thing that's become very apparent to us is that a lay board just doesn't work in our community. So that's the main reason, getting rid of the HOA and letting people who do it for a living be in charge of our community. We think was really the #1 reason to become part of Wellington. We have a lot of respect for how Wellington does business, and we just felt that because we're attached to it, we're right there next to the preserves. I mean, really, my backyard is less than 100 yards away from Wellington property, as I live almost right on the connection point of 50th Street. So from my perspective, our board has worked diligently and for a long time to try to get to this point. What we intend to do, if you pass this and move this forward, we want to get out a package to our community so they can read through and see. We'll have town halls, make sure we iron out everything, make sure we get 2/3 of the community. See if we can get 2/3 of the community consent, which we believe we can, okay, to dissolve the HOA and get rid of the covenants and restrictions so that we have a clean slate. So when we go into Wellington, we're Wellington. That's what we want to do. But there are elements of our community that we like to keep the same. We have a private gate, and that was a deal breaker for the people in our community. So we're going to have a private gate. So to do that, that's why Acme comes into play, and there's issues, issues that come into play that really make a lot of sense. I know sometimes when you hear them, you say, well, how's this all going to work? Well, basically, we're going to have the same services that we have now, but instead of paying it via HOA dues, it's going to be an assessment that's going to be paid to y'all. That's basically how that's basically going to work. It's apples to apples. It's just a different mechanism to get to the same place. And that being said, I just figured I'd leave myself open in case you have any questions for me, because I think that when I speak for everyone. We're all on the same page.
Very well, thank you.
Thanks.
Boom.
Just his whole 3 minutes. Very good.
Okay, next is Stephen. Can you help me, Madam Mayor?
Annunziata. I was going to say
That was good.
Annunziata, but you were the
He
one
knew-
with
he
the
was walking up. He knew it
penmanship
was him.
issue.
He knew it was him and he's helping from the.
And we don't really grade on penmanship. I'm just giving you a hard time, Steve.
It's horrible, I know it. Stephen Unziata, I live at 1128 Manatee Terrace in Lake Worth, Homeland. I've been a resident there for 24 years. I was a 10-year resident of Wellington before that. Love Wellington, love the community that I'm in now. I live there, my daughter lives there, my grandchildren live there, and my major concern is really what you were all talking about is the future of Homeland. And I want my kids to be able to stay there and enjoy the things that I have and to see it progress a little bit. It has sort of, when you drive through it, you'll see that it hasn't really changed. And when I first moved in there, that was the way they wanted it. They really didn't want it to change. And now I think that the consensus is that there's a majority of people that want to see it developed, and they want to see it consistent, and they want to see some government. And Wellington is the perfect fit for that. I do business in Wellington. I love the Wellington people. Everybody's very professional, and we have a little bit of a disconnect with the people that have all their hearts are in the right place. They all volunteer to step up and do the dirty work of being on the board, and it's just it's just difficult. So I'm thrilled that we're here at this point and able to at least have you guys consider bringing us in, and I think that there's no doubt that there's a majority of people in there that are also interested in that.
Very well. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you.
And our last card is Ellen Warhead. Okay.
Okay, she supports.
Very good.
For the record, when it comes to whether this is Wellington or Lake Worth, you guys know you live in neither one of those. It's not Wellington or Lake Worth, it's unincorporated Palm Beach County. So if you write Wellington on your address, you still get your mail. If you write Lake Worth on there, you still get your mail because you're in unincorporated Palm Beach County. So I don't want Lake Worth to think that we're taking out some of their people in our discussion here. The other interesting fact that I have to bring, since I have been given the binder of the incorporation of Wellington. I have the original binder from the successful one. I'm saving it for the Historical Society. The first time that Wellington incorporation was attempted, it didn't pass. And there were two neighborhoods that threw the numbers off, and it was Homeland and Wycliffe. So looking at what happened the first time, when it didn't pass, by lopping off Homeland and Wycliffe, Wellington became incorporated. So just for historical information along the way, the original idea was for Homeland to be a part of Wellington. So whether that matters now,
We've come full circle.
Trying to bring it back to the future.
Buyer's remorse.
There was a strange "we told you so" element to
There was,
that.
well, there was, and I do use that when we talk to Wycliffe, because they do the same conversation with us every once in a while. They say, well, should we be part of Wellington? Why aren't we? We pay water bills to Wellington, and those kinds of conversations. But interestingly enough, they've changed their mind, and now they're at the table. So. Questions of Mr. Kurtz?
The two-thirds community vote happens before we start our public hearing process, right? That's the initiator?
Yes,
Make sure they're all
they
on board?
have to have a two-thirds vote of their landowners to determine whether they are in favor of annexing and also dissolving the homeowner association and amending the declaration. So that's going to be the first thing that's going to happen, and then everything else is going to flow from that.
And that's not the landowners that respond. It's 2/3 of actual property
Yeah,
owners.
Correct.
There are two separate votes required when you're looking at the HOA documents. Those are 2/3 of the owners of the property, period. That's, that you have, if there are 100 homeowners. and
One lot, one vote.
One lot, one vote. And if there are 100 homeowners, they have to have 67 in order to do that. When it goes to the
Referendum.
ballot, if there are 100 voters that show up, 51 of them have to vote yes. So in that case, it is registered voters. It doesn't matter if they own the land or if they just live there. It's registered voters.
But before you would pass your annexation ordinance, you would have, or even considered your annexation ordinance, you would have gotten the word that there were 2/3 of the
Right.
lot owners out there that wanted to move forward with this process as outlined in the
And
agreement.
that part should actually happen fairly quickly.
But as the board indicates, they want to put it out to the folks. They are asking for people to get back with the consents within 30 days. They actually have 90 days from the date that the first consent is received. So basically 90 days is the outside, but we're looking to know faster than that.
When you say it's the outside, because if 2/3 come back positively before that
Beforehand.
time.
We go, yeah, it's, you don't have to extend it out. It's once you get 2/3 of the consent that, 2/3 to consent, you're done with your dissolution process, or the dissolution affirmation.
All right. Any other questions from, and we discussed yesterday that this was the step one. So.
I was just going to say that,
Councilwoman.
yesterday we discussed that this would be a lot easier if there was no dissolution of the HOA and you were just annexing in to Wellington, but that seems to be the driving force behind wanting to do this. I would just
correct.
hope that the residents.
Can I just respond to you?
Oh, I don't know.
No.
Normally don't
You'll have to
allow,
come up
but
here,
I think
Charlie.
that,
That yesterday we also brought up 604.50. I would just hope that the residents understand that by dissolving the HOA, they may have some protections or that they enjoy now that they won't because of 604.50.
604.
Or any other.
Or, right.
Yeah.
any
yeah.
other municipality, more
Right.
powers are given to a POA or HOA
Right.
There
in
are-
some
Have more-
regards.
There's advantages to the declaration and covenants, and unfortunately in this community, there is an element that has weaponized those declaration of covenants, and it's the board's opinion that it would be better to take the weapon away.
And one of the things that we will be very clear about through every step of this process is what the village can do, the fact that covenants and restrictions, even if they continue to exist, the village would not enforce them here. We don't enforce them anywhere. And we will tell them what the limitations of our ordinances are and what the limitations of state statutes are. We will make sure that everybody is aware of those.
Well, and to that point, there is a little bit of a disconnect between the proposed sub-area H regulations and what Wellington will be able to enforce. So if the residents have an expectation that they can only have 4 stalls on a particular lot, and if someone comes in and wants to extend that and it's a bona fide, good faith, commercial, agricultural use, then the village would not be able to
That's
protect
one
them
of-
from that.
One of the things that'll happen with that sub-area H is that 604.50 disclaimer will be added to it, as it probably should be to the entirety of the equestrian overlay zoning district.
Or at least address it in public hearings, because, you know, we don't know ultimately what will happen with 604.50. As I've mentioned to you before, we have asked the Supreme Court to exercise its discretionary jurisdiction, and we're waiting for a decision. If they decided to exercise that jurisdiction and quashed the decision of the 4th District Court of Appeal that kind of created created difficulties for Wellington to enforce its codes, then we would be left with the status quo that we were in when the decision was affirmed by the circuit court, and then you'll have to make some policy decisions on going forward, how you want to handle 604.50.
But that would be true no matter what municipality.
604.50 affects all of Wellington.
Correct.
It'll
All of the state of Florida.
It affects the county. It affects
Right.
every county and every municipality in the state. It's the law of the state. And for non-residential farm buildings, that's
Including,
that's what you do not necessarily have to get a permit for, a building permit or the zoning regulations. That's clear.
But that's not unique to this circumstance.
That is not unique to this town or this circumstance.
And the units of development, sub-area, we have other sub-areas that do have different rules. So that's not that unique. We have little ranches, we have rustic ranches, and they have unique rules that we've agreed to.
And winding
within-
trails.
And
Winding trails.
and winding trails, exactly. So that's something that we are accustomed to. And again, I do support this for the reasons stated. I think it's a good fit. I think it's a good relationship. And I think it benefits us, the Village of Wellington, and the residents. We'll be picking up a tax base out of this, and they'll be paying for the services that they get. I think it's a good fit. But in the meantime, this is just the first date, like the vice mayor was saying last night. This is the first step. It's the first talk into it. And now we're going to wait to hear, if this passes tonight, we'll wait to hear that you either have the 2/3 or you don't of the owner.
And some of the steps will be concurrent. You'll get a facilities report, and your staff will begin the annexation report. They may get the annexation, the annexation report being finalized, and the result of the dissolution.
It's not a linear process.
They'll probably coalesce.
And I think that's a key point to make, is that I support it at this step. I want to make sure, though, that as this now evolves, that this is good for Wellington as well. I think there's some clear advantages for the residents of Homeland, but also we want to make sure on our end that Wellington's going to benefit from this relationship as well. So I've heard enough tonight via the staff's recommendation to go ahead and ask you all out on a date. And then we'll see if we like you and you like us. And hopefully we got a perfect marriage here in the end. But there's a lot of steps that have to happen between tonight and reaching that point. And I think, it's reasonable enough to at least move forward tonight.
But I think as we vote on this, people need to know that we're not making it happen tonight. It's just laying out the process.
Well,
It's
there's
a
still, as
consideration.
we saw on the slide, there's 14 steps or whatever. I mean,
It's a lot of decision points.
Yeah, basically what's being considered tonight, since I'm summarizing a lot of bullets for everybody's vote this evening, is we're approving the process move forward, and also approving of the annexation agreement as it's been presented and revised this evening.
And just to note, though, the sub-area H regulations, they were developed in concert with your staff. Your staff's been aware of them, and they haven't gone through their entire analysis, but they're very well aware of them, and they believe it's appropriate for the
Well, we have time
community.
to all look at them, and those are going to go through the committee process. And
They will. But people have already worked on them hard. I just want to let you know.
Mr. Kurtz, I do have one question, which is in regards to the current HOA. What is the percentage of residents that are current versus not current in their HOA dues?
I would defer to, I think Ellen is probably the best person.
She is going to have to come up.
You have to come to the microphone.
See, she didn't want to speak, but we got her to speak.
I'm Ellen Warrett. Should I give you my address too? 11297 Roseland Way, Lake Worth or Wellington.
Or neither.
Okay. Our dues are collected in January and April. So we're just in February now. I would say I'm guessing that at least half have paid the first payment, and they are getting them in. The process in our community has been a little bit slow, but we are a well-heeled community. We have the money. Some people are, we haven't always been strict on getting them to pay on time, so they have responded accordingly. We are trying to, we turn off gate codes and we do other things to try and encourage them to make the payment. But the truth is, I don't know the exact number, but I think that I'm going to guess at least half have paid at this point in time, the first payment.
Right,
And
you're
many
talking
have
about-
paid the whole year.
You're
so.
talking about January's payment.
January's payment.
Right,
And-
so take me back. Tell me about 2018.
Councilman,
In
can I ask
2008
you a question about that? Because those past ones wouldn't have anything to do with us, and this would go on the tax bill, correct? I mean,
Right, this would be on the tax bill, so it's
But
not like an
I-
assessment in the future.
But the past ones, I understood from yesterday's conversation that that was none of our assessment, that's brought in. How does that work, Lori?
Well, once the uniform method of assessment is done by, and it goes on the tax rolls, they'll have to pay those assessments. And if they fail to do so, there's a process, for handling that through by state statute. So it's not something that concerns the dues that they're currently paying. I can assure you they're going to pay more promptly when it's on their tax bill.
And I would also say, I think at the end of last year, there might have been 5 out of the 283 that had to go to collections to get paid.
The statute provides a remedy for failure to pay your assessments.
Because it's your tax bill once this
Exactly.
happens. But prior to all of the collections that they're due, we have nothing to do with that.
No.
Correct? Okay, so I'm just, I didn't mean
Right,
to
and the only other thing I would say is we have a lot of reserves. In fact, we have over $1 million in reserves to do our roads, and we have another reserve of about $60,000 in case we have issues with our gate and the computer system there. So we have quite a bit of reserves already established and in the bank.
Right. And what's happening with the reserves if this goes forward?
At this point, those discussions have actually occurred because those questions occurred to us as well as their board members, and they would have to make that determination prior to dissolution and any follow-up that allows them for any post-dissolution activities pursuant to their dissolution paperwork. But that would be at the discretion of the board,
Right.
So,
their board.
well,
And we are very seriously considering paving our roads prior to the end of the year. So that would take up a good fraction of our road reserve, if not all of it. Our roads are due to be repaved. They're 20 years since the last major paving, and there's a general consensus that that would be a good thing to do over the next year. We're actually at the point of collecting bids to do the paving. Okay?
Yeah, as with any corporation, there's a winding down process that would be involved. They would have to go through and extinguish any and all liabilities. They have to deal with any litigation that may be pending. So it's not like when you say you're going to be dissolved that happens the next day. The winding down process will take some time, and they've got to be there to make sure that this process goes forward and they transfer the interest in the roadway and so forth that's contemplated within the agreement.
And the title work was all done on that now. We've got the information.
We did a preliminary title search. In our, there's some question whether Homeland owns the road, but I think that there's enough there. They will provide a special warranty deed and an owner's title policy, and that will protect the village in the event there was some challenge to ownership.
Any other questions from the council? Is there a motion? We do need a motion on this.
Yes.
I'll move to we move forward with exploring annexation and approving the agreement.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously.
Thank you
Thank you
very,
very
very much.
Okay,
Once
that
again,
brings
thank you
us
to your
to,
staff.
do we have any comment cards? We do not have any comment cards for public.
We do, we
have
do,
one.
we do, we do. Yep, yep.
Were we supposed to have heard that?
No, it was in the public
No, I
forum.
think we asked earlier.
Okay.
No, you can, come on. It's time, Bruce.
Yes. This is the public forum. Name and address for the record.
My name is Bruce Tooman. I reside at 752 Lake Wellington Drive in the village of Wellington. According to our staff, last week's Eagles tribute band drew 3,000 people. Apparently, the people already love us, as is. While there are a lot of people I met at the concert did not live in Wellington, I was more concerned about the lack of restrooms and parking spaces, as well as the trip hazard with our sound cables. You know, of all the expensive, grandiose town center plans that were forced on us, I don't recall any of them dealing with bathrooms. Pursuant to our building code, for 3,000 people, we need nearly 60 toilets. We barely have 20. Boy, there was a long line during the concert, and if we keep that up, maybe people won't show up anymore. Table 7.2-1, minimum off-street parking standards in our land development regulations requires 1,000 spaces for 3,000 people. We don't even have 500. If you want us to follow your rules, you better follow them too. Provide porta potties when you have large events until additional facilities can be built, because we do need them. Open the green area where the tennis courts were for overflow parking. That's what it was originally designed for way back when. I saw the site plan. And do this before you violate our codes again. And please, 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 please extend the underground sound cable tunnel so people won't trip over it and sue the village. Now, that was all I have, but I still have a minute left. So a couple of the comments that was made tonight about the sound. A sound study was supposed to be done when we do the new amphitheater. Well, was it done for the first amphitheater? I live on a lake 2 miles down the road, and I can hear the music. So apparently no sound study was done before. Will it be done again? And you're talking about public input. Where was the public input before? And hopefully you'll ask for public input in the future. And last, just because you can spend our taxes doesn't mean you have to. You can always give it back to us. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you. Any other public comment? I'm sorry, you have to fill out a card, Vince, and come up. I'm sorry, I hate to do that to you, but it's our rule. You'll need to fill out a card again if you don't mind after you speak.
Along the lines of Vincent Weber, 2143 Wingate Bend, Wellington. In accordance with some of the remarks of this gentleman, I'll give you a for instance of what happened to me the other night. I was overutilizing one of our restaurants here in Wellington. Come out of my car after dinner, found a boot on my car. When I called the police, had them come, I asked them, why are you booting? He says, well, people are walking over here from the concert, getting parking here, getting food here, and going over to the concert. I said, well, I wasn't there. Well, he said, they saw you coming in. I said, I lived right there. This is the kind, and I was only one of 8, I think, 7 or 8. The merchants are not happy. The people that own the restaurants over there, the people that own the stores, people were coming out of Publix that were booted. It just isn't being followed through properly. And I think that's something that's got to be given some consideration to with all of these concerts and things that we're having. I hear the music too. I like it most of the time. Some of the rap stuff is, yeah. But that is not a problem. The problem is what's happening with the parking and its effect on all of the merchants and the citizens in some cases in Wellington. And I think that should be given some consideration by the board.
Thank you. Thank you. That was in social media. People tagged me in posts about getting booted. It was on Channel 5. Mr. Schofield, we have a comment on that. Basically, we don't enforce the private parking. That's up to the private property owners.
Mr. Barnes, you have the pictures. I think I had some pictures taken of that. Yes, that has been a,
And it has been announced at the amphitheater. If you're coming to
So-
amphitheater events, you cannot park in the private spaces, only spaces that allow us, which we thank the Chancellor Shops and the Chancellor Building for allowing patrons to park there, but it's their choice, mostly because their businesses are closed at that time.
we have, before our events, we physically post signs at the entrances to the shopping center saying, don't park here for events.
Additional
There are signs
parking.
throughout the shopping center. There are signs on the amphitheater if you walk forward, and we make announcements there. We have an agreement with Chancellor to use their parking spaces. We also make the parking spaces at Lake Wellington Professional Center available.
And this site also on
Yes.
Village Hall, they can park
And
here.
then we provide, now zoom out, we provide signage in front as you're walking out of Town Square Plaza into the amphitheater area that basically are A-frames like that. We have a banner that we hang on the split rail fence, and but what you do see is Town Square also has it, you know, throughout their property as far as Town Square
Oh, there it is.
shoppers only, patrons only throughout, so.
And you
And
can
we do
understand.
provide routine announcements,
Mhm.
you know, at the beginning of the event, in the middle of the event, during intermission, and that type of thing.
And we have tried working with the center. Mr. Weber indicated that he had been booted using a restaurant in there. I suspect if, I don't know how to resolve that. We'll certainly talk to Regency again.
Well,
But
you
it is
could-
private property, and
And they need to
and it
have
is
spaces
posted.
for their businesses. I mean, I have, of course, compassion for residents who didn't know, but those shopping centers have built those parking spaces for their patrons, and they need to be able to, if their businesses are open, the reason Chancellor does it is theirs are closed. So it's not an inconvenience to them. So when we can get cooperation, we have tried.
Well, and if those businesses are upset about it and want a different policy, they need to take it up with the owner of the plaza.
And certainly as
Thanks, Vinny. We can't take public comment unless you're on the microphone. So, but it's fine. We've got it. We know it's an ongoing problem. It was worse when it was very well-attended events.
right, and certainly given that the Tribute Festival, which is a 3-day event versus an individual one-off Thursday or Saturday concert event, we're going to look at shuttle options that we do for our larger events, where if we're able to secure parking off-site, we would look at that and factor that into if we're able to cover that cost as part of the event budget.
Okay, very well. Okay, that brings us to the end of the meeting. Mr. Schofield, do you have anything you need to add?
attorney's reports.
Oh, I'm
The only-
sorry. I was
that's
going the
okay.
wrong order.
I'm going
No
to be
problem.
mercifully short.
I just had wanted to mention one thing, and that is that the Pine Tree Water Control District, Mr. Tooman, the Pine Tree Water Control District voluntarily dismissed its lawsuit against the village. It's without prejudice, but it was voluntarily dismissed. So I just wanted to update you and the residents on that.
Okay, the next regular council meeting will be held here on Tuesday, March the 12th at 7 p.m. And then the March 26th meeting has been canceled due to conflicts with the end of spring break. Tomorrow night, Senator Kevin Rader and Representative Matt Wilhite will be holding a town hall meeting here in the council chambers beginning at 7. And then we have Marchtoberfest on March the 9th and Bacon and Bourbon on March the 22nd and March the 23rd.
Did you say a meeting was canceled?
The 26th of March, yes, we canceled
Okay.
that.
Just, I didn't have that on
I
my
think
calendar.
that's during the League of Cities
It is.
week in
Okay.
Tallahassee.
Spring break in League of Cities. And we had taken that off schedule months ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Might still be on my calendar. I'll show up now.
You get the night off.
Okay.
Is that it? That was
Yes,
all you
ma'am.
had?
I'm done.
Okay, okay. Councilwoman, would you like to go first in comments?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think since our last council meeting, Joe DiMaggio Children's Hospital had their grand opening, so I just wanted to welcome them to the community, and we're looking forward to having them here. And then Brewfest happened since then, and that was a really fun event. A lot of people came up to me and said we need more of these kind of events, and everyone seemed to have a good time, and I don't think there were any incidents, so kudos to staff for putting on a really fun, well-attended event.
Councilman McGovern?
I just want to say that I hope that, to echo the comment from the manager, that there'll be a town hall meeting. I believe, Mr. Schofield, is it here?
It's here in this chamber, yes.
This chamber with Senator Rader and Representative Wellhite tomorrow. It'll be a chance to talk to them just before session begins. I look forward to traveling with many of you to Palm Beach County Days and to meet with many of our legislators and state officials to Tallahassee next week. And I would like to congratulate Pam Tahan on being appointed the permanent CEO of Wellington Regional Medical Center.
Former president of the Young Professionals in Wellington, by the way.
Very, very good.
That's her biggest
One of
claim
our
to fame.
own. Very nice.
Yeah, oh, and I do want to thank the staff. It was a pleasure to go with you for Josh's benches for awareness for suicide and mental health awareness, and I want to thank our staff for working with this organization to get this bench placed at Village Park. So, thank you to Parks and Rec staff for that.
Very well. Mr. Vice Mayor?
Yeah, I just want to join my colleague in congratulating Ms. Tehan. Excellent choice by Wellington Regional. She'll do great things for the hospital, and we look forward to working with her. Also, Mr. Schofield, I wanted to ask you, where are we in the planning of the visioning?
Good question.
Have we gotten
A date?
suggestions from council yet on topics?
I have them from two of you, and I promise not to continue hounding you weekly until I have them from all of you.
Yeah, because it's hard to get all of our schedules in order, and so as time passes, it's going to be pushed out further and further, and I'd like to at least get to a point where we can get it on the books and then go from there, so. Okay, thanks.
Very well.
That's it for me.
Councilman?
I want to apologize. I missed the gender review yesterday, but I was down in Miami at the Safe Streets Summit, which was a combination of the Palm Beach TPA, Transportation Planning Agency, the Broward MPO, and whatever Dade calls their organization, to talk about improving walkability and alternative transportation options for your city, village, municipality, whatever, what have you. It's a lot of aspirational goals, but there's ways that they've talked about and trying to find more ways to get people out of their cars and either on bikes or on even the electric scooters, which have had very good success rates and very low accident incidents, despite what has been incorrectly reported before. I do want to commend our sign language interpreter because I watched her when Mr. Barnes was talking faster than I talk, and I believe she actually kept up and accurately reported everything you said. She was going a mile a minute, but so was Mr. Barnes. So impressive, good job. And don't forget, Saturday is the Pinewood Derby. Wellington has a
yes.
Wellington has a car. I cannot promise you it's going to win, but I'm going to go out on a limb and promise you it might be one of our most unique looking cars and faster than past cars. So the firefighters seem to have really good.
Fast cars. That's your standard.
Well, the firefighters seem
than?
to have good at response time, so that it's hard to beat them because I think they have something.
Are you assuring us we're going to beat the sheriff's office?
Yes.
Okay, there we are.
But I'll go out.
All right.
I'll go out on a limb on that.
There's
yes.
some trash talk from the council up here. All right. Very good, and I appreciate
It was
you doing
co-designed
that.
by my 13-year-old son, who's down one thumb, but we did a good job.
I have a question, actually. The scooters that was discussed, was that like the Razor type ones?
The electric ones.
Okay, because I'm seeing them now more and more in other cities. I saw them in Nashville and they're in Atlanta, and they're fascinating. You can just rent them and drop them off anywhere, and someone comes and picks them up.
There's a detailed study that Portland, Oregon did it for a while, and they said they are now getting 5,800 trips per day on those scooters and to reduce car trips by 30%. So I don't know how they're doing it in Portland. I don't know how connected they are, but it can be done.
Very good, and I've attended the Safe Street Summit before, and it's pretty eye-opening and thank you for taking that on and for dedicating your time to it, Councilman, because it's a lot of time that the TPA takes on top of everything else that we have to do. So, but in the meantime, it's sad when you look at the statistics when you start out of how dangerous by design Florida roadways are. So we've got a long way to go, and I appreciate you doing that, and hopefully we can bring some ideas back to the village through that and some funding opportunities as we go. So with that said, I've gotten a lot of input from residents about the Classic Brew Fest. They were super happy that we limited ticket sales. Sometimes they've been to events where they didn't limit ticket sales and didn't have a good experience, so they wanted to say thank you for that. Really didn't hear any negatives about the entire event, and hopefully we would have heard back if there were any negative impacts. And I think some people decided to stay and for the Tribute Fest Foreigner concert afterwards, which was nice. You know, stay on site a little longer and have some more food before you do go home. So I appreciate all the efforts in that one. And I did have several, I'm sure you guys have too, people calling and saying, wow, that was so much fun. I didn't even see you there, but I know you were there because I saw you on social media, but it was very well attended. So as we look forward to, hats off to Mr. Barnes, not just for fast talking during meetings, but for a great event, because he had a lot to do with that and all the staff members that were involved. So with that, thank you. This meeting is adjourned.